Hey guys, it's X What If, and welcome to part 1 of What If Yuji Was Like Aizen. I apologize for taking so long for me to start this series, but I'm about to end the girl series, and I'm coming up on the end of the What If Yuji Was Like All For One as well, so I promised this would happen, so here it is. Starting this story off, things would happen per regular. Yuji would have been born, but something was different. Kinjaku would notice this, realizing that Yuji seemingly has no cursed energy at all. But that would be impossible. Kinjaku knows that he planted Yuji with the finger of Sukuna, so why exactly would Yuji have no cursed energy at all? Kinjaku would be confused beyond belief and just chalk this up as a failure. He would simply tell himself that he was going to let the boy live and just start over from scratch, creating a new vessel. As the years would pass, Yuji would grow up with his grandfather, but his grandfather would notice some weird things about Yuji. Yuji was a somewhat quiet kid, as he kept to himself most of the time. His grandfather would also realize that Yuji's strength was off the charts. He was even stronger than he originally was in canon. His speed as well was something that his grandfather couldn't fathom. Growing up, keeping to himself, Yuji would know that cursed energy exists within the world. He could feel it, as well as use it, but he always kept it to himself. He would use his cursed energy, letting it flow throughout his body, controlling it as much as he could at a young age, without letting his grandfather know. Yuji would keep this secret to himself and hone his abilities as much as he could. Around the age of 10, Yuji's grandfather would ask Yuji if he could tell him something about his parents. Yuji, being curious, would tell his grandfather to go ahead. Yuji's grandfather would then explain to Yuji that his mother was kind of weird. Yuji would laugh at his grandfather, saying that that wasn't nice, but his grandfather would have a serious face. He would tell Yuji that he wasn't kidding. His mother had scars on top of her head, and she cursed their entire family. Yuji's grandfather would tell Yuji that that's the reason that his father isn't alive today. Yuji would then have a serious look on his face. He would then think to himself, someone with stitches on their forehead. Just then, a memory would flash in Yuji's head. With him being held as a baby, he would remember his mother did have stitches on her forehead, and he would remember his grandfather telling his father that he would die if he continued messing with the woman. Yuji would take this thought into consideration and tell his grandfather thank you. For the next 5 years, Yuji would begin doing his own research. He would be attempting to research more things about cursed energy, as well as training himself to make his cursed energy efficiency even stronger. Every day since he could use cursed energy, he had been using it as if it was a regular thing, training his body to use cursed energy more and more. He would also learn about the existence of Jujutsu sorcerers. He would also see cursed spirits every now and then, putting what he practiced into play on the cursed spirits, although he would always stay low and never reveal himself. And if a Jujutsu sorcerer were to come by, he would cover his cursed energy, pretending to be simply a normal citizen. He would watch over Jujutsu sorcerers and study them and how they operate, realizing that Jujutsu sorcerers were actually ineffective. He would recall what had happened down in Shinjuku, Tokyo, and how there were about 1,000 cursed spirits that were rampant. He had watched the Jujutsu sorcerers from afar take on the thousands of cursed spirits, yet he would see majority of them die, realizing that a lot of Jujutsu sorcerers were weak and ineffective at their job. It seemed to Yuji that the sole purpose of a Jujutsu sorcerer was simply to go to battle to die. He would think it was stupid. However, at the same time, he would learn a lot of things from Jujutsu sorcerers, like how they utilize their cursed energy, or how they put up barriers and veils. Yuji would then find barrier techniques to be somewhat interesting, as they were the only thing somewhat complicated in Jujutsu sorcery. There could be certain attributes put on barriers that would allow certain people in and out of it, or simply to not allow anyone from the outside to see, or vice versa. At the same time, you could stack multiple barriers on top of each other to prevent someone from realizing that there's a barrier there in the first place. There were so many things you could do with barriers, and Yuji was interested in it. However, there was one person Yuji was interested in the most, and his name was Gojo Satoru. Yuji wanted to know how his ability had worked. He had seen it in the night parade of 100 demons. However, he wanted to know how the barrier that was in between Gojo worked. As time would continue to pass, Yuji would simply do the same thing. He would practice on his own using Jujutsu sorcery, as well as watching other Jujutsu sorcerers, going home to his grandfather and acting like everything was normal. As one day, Yuji would be at school, acting normal. He would then overhear a group called the Occult Club talking about how they found a cursed object. This would pique Yuji's interest, seeing as he's heard of cursed objects, he's just never been able to get his hands on one. He would overhear the occult club saying that they were going to be at the school later tonight to open up the cursed object. However, later in the day, Yuji would go to the occult club room and he could see it and feel it, the malice coming off of a box. He would open it up and see a grotesque finger inside of the box. He would raise an eyebrow and ask, was this really a cursed object? But seeing as he could feel the cursed energy coming off of it, he knew that it was. He would swipe the entire box, putting it in his bag, and continue to go on about his way, going to the hospital to go see his grandfather. As he would be walking out of the school, there would be a jujutsu sorcerer there, as Yuji would be able to tell because of the clothes the boy wore. Yuji, not wanting the sorcerer to stop him, they'll put a small barrier around his bag, overlapping it numerous times, walking right past the boy without the finger being noticed at all. He would then head to the hospital, where he would talk to his grandfather for a bit, again acting as if everything was normal. As his grandfather would then begin to talk to Yuji, he would tell Yuji that he knows there's something different about Yuji. He's known ever since Yuji was little. Yuji isn't like all the other kids, and he never has been. Yuji would get confused, thinking that his cover was blown already, but his grandfather would simply tell him that no matter what anybody thinks about Yuji, he should strive to be the best version of himself. His grandfather would be about to say something else, however, a huge cursed spirit would crash through the building as it would launch itself at Yuji. Yuji would be confused as to why a cursed spirit was attacking him. He was suppressing his cursed energy and had a barrier around the finger, so there should be no reason a cursed spirit would be attacking him right now. But unknown to Yuji, somebody was following him this entire time. The person would begin to slowly clap, telling Yuji that he was surprised. He never expected him to be some kind of genius. Yuji would look up and see a man with a scar on his forehead. He would then recall the words that his grandfather had told him. Putting two and two together, Yuji would simply look up and calmly say that this man must be his mother. Kenjaku would have a shocked look on his face, realizing that Yuji had already put it together. Just having a simple look at him, Kenjaku would laugh and say that he guesses Yuji wasn't such a failure after all. Kenjaku would then tell Yuji that he put a barrier around the hospital, but he's pretty sure the jujutsu sorcerers will be here any moment, so he's going to make this quick. He would tell Yuji that he would need to take the finger out of his bag and consume it. However, Yuji would tell Kenjaku that he doesn't plan on doing any such thing. He's going to study the finger and figure out what exactly it is. Yuji would tell Kenjaku that he wants to take the cursed energy that was inside of the object and siphon it into himself, so he could have even more cursed energy than he already has. Kenjaku would laugh at Yuji and say that he guesses someone with little to no cursed energy is trying to figure out how to gain more cursed energy. It would only make more sense. Yuji wouldn't say anything. Yuji didn't realize until this moment just now. Kenjaku hadn't realized that Yuji had been suppressing his cursed energy for a very long time now. Ever since Yuji was cognitive, his cursed energy was being suppressed. Kenjaku would then speak up and tell Yuji to simply give him the finger. He doesn't want to have to hurt one of his children. Yuji would then tell Kenjaku that fine, he was going to give him the finger, but to not destroy the building anymore because his grandfather was trying to die peacefully. Kenjaku would be abused by how unfazed Yuji was in the moment, but would continue to laugh. Yuji would reach his hand in his bag and grab onto the box, handing it straight towards Kenjaku. Kenjaku would grab onto the box and tell Yuji that he appreciates him for not making it difficult for either of them. Yuji would then ask Kenjaku was that all he wanted, as Kenjaku would tell Yuji that he's going to go reawaken Sukuna. Since Yuji was a huge failure, he had started his next plan immediately after. He created another vessel for Sukuna, and he was going to use him instead of Yuji. Yuji would roll his eyes and turn back around towards his grandfather, telling Kenjaku that now that he has the finger, he could leave. Kenjaku would tell Yuji that things were going to get very exciting in the future for everybody, so he would tell Yuji to stay on his toes. Yuji would wave Kenjaku away, as he would start tending to his grandfather, asking if he was okay. But unknown to Yuji, his grandfather had passed before the cursed spirit even crashed into the building. Yuji would take a deep breath and say that it was unfair. His grandfather was probably the only person that he actually enjoyed being around, and Kenjaku ruined his last moments with him. How unfortunate. Yuji would then reach in his bag and pull out a box. He would open it up, and Sukuna's finger would be inside. He would tell himself that this had better be worth it. As the day would end, Yuji would go collect his grandfather's ashes and return to his home once more. He would then begin to study the finger, immediately realizing that there was a soul residing inside of the finger. He would then think on all of his research that he's done before and what he's heard in Jujutsu Society. This must be the finger of Ryomen Sukuna, the man who separated his soul into 20 objects. If Yuji was able to siphon the cursed energy off of this finger into himself, who knows what would happen. Seeing that he knows Kenjaku had something to do with his birth, he doesn't want to grab the soul that was inside of the finger, only the cursed energy itself. He would just be lost on how to be able to do it. If he could figure out how Sukuna was able to transfer himself inside of the finger, he would be able to figure out how to transfer the cursed energy itself inside of him. It was going to be a task, but Yuji was down for it. He had all the time in the world. Well, all the time until Kenjaku figured out that the finger that he had handed him was fake. Yuji had used one of his curse techniques on Kenjaku without him realizing at all. For the time being, Yuji would simply study the finger and try to figure out how exactly Sukuna was able to separate his body into 20 different objects. As days would pass, Yuji would be studying, learning more and more about the finger, trying to put his own cursed energy inside of the finger. Albeit the finger reject his cursed energy, he would still figure out how to do it, and in doing so, he would then figure out how to do the opposite. Getting even more into depth, he would then figure out how to, instead of separating the soul from the objects, to simply take out the cursed energy, leaving the soul residing inside of the object, merging Sukuna's cursed energy with himself. As Yuji could feel it, the sudden surge of violent cursed energy, even if it was only for simply a second, his cursed energy would have flared, while also having the presence of Sukuna's cursed energy. Realizing that that might get the attention of people that he doesn't want, he would hurry up and attempt to suppress this cursed energy. However, unknown to Yuji, it would already be too late. The Jujutsu sorcerers would have taken notice of this and sent people out to go investigate. Seeing as it had something to do with Sukuna's presence, they would send Gojo Satoru. As Gojo would make it to Yuji's place of residence, he would knock on the door, as Yuji would simply walk up to the door and answer. Seeing who it was, he would immediately begin to scan Gojo up and down, as Gojo would take notice of this, scanning Yuji as well. Gojo would then tell Yuji that he's pretty curious for someone he's just met. Yuji would then tell Gojo that of course he's curious. It's a tall man with white hair and a blindfold at his doorstep. Who else wouldn't be curious? Gojo would laugh and say that he can't say anything about that. He would then ask Yuji if he knows anything about the presence of Sukuna. Yuji would raise his eyebrow and ask Gojo who Sukuna was. Gojo would smile and tell Yuji that he's a big bad, and that it'd be pretty dangerous if he were to be let free and roam about. Yuji would then tell Gojo that he doesn't know anything about any kind of Sukuna, and that he was having a nice nap before this, so if he could let him get back to it, that would be nice. Gojo would laugh and say that he apologizes for intruding, and that he would take his leave. Gojo would turn around as Yuji would begin to close the door. Just then, Gojo would say, "However, I find it weird that you don't know anything about Sukuna, however your cursed energy tells me otherwise." Yuji's heart would begin to sink to the floor. He would begin asking himself a million questions in his head. When did he figure out? How did he figure out? Who is this guy exactly? How does he know that he has cursed energy? No one has been able to sense that Yuji had cursed energy, not even Kenjaku himself, so how did Gojo do it? Yuji would then begin to stare at Gojo, as Gojo would then begin to tell Yuji he was going to ask him one more time, does he know anything about Sukuna? In the split second, Gojo could feel hesitation from Yuji. Gojo would then proceed to tell Yuji that if he can't answer his questions here, he will have to answer the questions back at Jujutsu High. Just as Yuji would be about to open his mouth, Gojo would teleport in front of Yuji, tapping his hands on his forehead, knocking him out. This would be the first time Yuji had ever been caught off guard. As Yuji would wake up, he would be in a room full of seals, as he would be tied down to a chair, as Gojo would be there in front of him, sitting down in a chair as well. Gojo would look at Yuji and ask him if he's finally awake. Yuji would have a terrified look on his face and ask where he was exactly. Gojo would tell Yuji not to worry and that he was at Jujutsu High right now. Yuji would think to himself in his head, if he was at Jujutsu High, there was so much more he could learn and research, so he would use this to his advantage.
Yuji would continue to be scared, asking Gojo why do they have him tied down to a chair and bound. Gojo would then say that he's under suspicion for tampering with Sukuna's fingers, and the higher-ups don't like it at all. Whatever you did with the Sukuna finger that you had in your possession scared the higher-ups into wanting to take your head off. Albeit you didn't unleash Sukuna, from what I can read off you, you have his cursed energy. And that's enough for the higher-ups to be terrified of you. Yuji would then think again. He's still suppressing his cursed energy right now, so how is it that Gojo could see it? He would then come to the conclusion that it probably had something to do with that blindfold, or what was underneath it at least. Yuji would then tell Gojo he doesn't know what he did with the finger. He was messing around with it and something crazy happened. The only reason he took off earlier was because he was scared. Just imagine a tall man with white hair and a blindfold coming to your doorstep and questioning you. Wouldn't you think that's a little creepy too? Gojo would laugh and say that he can't say anything about that. However, whatever he did to the finger made it so the finger was ineffective. Gojo would hold the finger that Yuji had in his house in his hand and then take out another one as well. He would throw the other finger up in the air and use red to blast it into the wall. He would then tell Yuji to look at the finger, showing him that the finger was practically indestructible due to Sukuna's cursed energy. However, he would then begin to generate cursed energy into the other finger, as it would then begin to disintegrate slowly. He would then say to Yuji, usually, Sukuna's fingers are indestructible. However, whatever you did to it made it so the finger was able to be destroyed, and somehow, Sukuna wasn't able to take hold of your body either. But Sukuna's cursed energy is still felt throughout you. Yuji would then proceed to ask Gojo how exactly does he even know all of this. Gojo would then lift one side of his blindfold, telling Yuji it was with his 6 eyes, of course. Yuji would attempt to scan as much as he could, remembering the name 6 Eyes, and making sure to research it later. Gojo would then ask Yuji the question Yuji was waiting for and hoping for. Gojo would then tell Yuji, so how about this? Since the higher-ups believe that you have consumed Sukuna, you have an execution order out on your head. However, me being the kind of benevolent man that I am, have postponed your execution order. Except there's only one thing. In order for me to be able to postpone your execution order, you have to join Jujutsu High. So I have a question for you. Would you rather die now, or join Jujutsu High and die later? Since you technically have the ability to be able to absorb Sukuna's essence inside of you without reincarnating him, you have the chance to be a perfect host by collecting all 20 fingers, absorbing him inside of you, and then dying later. So which one would you like to choose? Yuji would then proceed to think about it, but he already knew his answer. Hesitantly, Yuji would say that he was going to die later and consume as many fingers as he could. And Gojo would look at Yuji and see a scared look on his face. However, inside of Yuji's head, he couldn't be any more excited. This was his chance. He was never able to get inside the Jujutsu High barrier, not without being attacked by a whole bunch of people. The barrier would have been an easier thing to take down. However, it's the people that were inside of it that would cause him trouble. But being able to go in and out of the Jujutsu High barrier without causing any type of suspicion, it was perfect for Yuji. And he could feel it. Somewhere in the Jujutsu High School, there was another barrier that was extremely complicated. It was like numerous barriers stacked on top of each other in a complex way. He wanted to find where it was and what it was. However, he would simply have to bide his time. Gojo would then free Yuji of his bindings and tell him to follow him. Gojo would tell Yuji that even though he had told him he was allowed to stay here, it wasn't really up to Gojo and that they had to go meet the principal. Yuji would roll his eyes, but he knew he had to get this over with. As him and Gojo would walk towards the principal's office, Gojo would be scanning Yuji up and down, trying to figure out exactly what was going on with him. He could feel Yuji's cursed energy. However, something was off about it, but for the first time, his 6 eyes weren't able to tell him exactly what it was. Gojo would simply chalk it up to Yuji having a specific cursed energy trait that was interfering with his 6 eyes. As they would get to the principal's office, Gojo would introduce Yuji to the principal, as Yuji would introduce himself as well. The principal would tell Yuji that he was going to keep this short. He knows the exact predicament he's in, so what would be a reason that Yuji would want to stay at Jujutsu High? Yuji would simply say because he wants to save people, but the principal would say that that wasn't enough, summoning one of his dolls and sending it at Yuji. As the doll would sprint towards Yuji, something weird would happen. The second it would make contact to Yuji would release a slight amount of his cursed energy, causing the doll to fall over and deactivate. The principal would be confused on what just happened, and Gojo was still not able to tell exactly what was going on with Yuji's cursed energy. However, Yuji would say he was going to rephrase his answer. He would tell the principal that he wants to be the best version of himself, and that includes saving people. If he's able to stay here and get stronger, or absorb Sukuna's fingers because it's the only thing he's able to do, he would do it. Knowing that Sukuna's fingers cause harm to other people, he's willing to take on that burden. The principal would stare on at Yuji and tell him that he accepts his answer and that he's welcome to stay at Jujutsu High. As time would pass, Yuji would act accordingly. He would play along with the Jujutsu sorcerers at daytime, doing what they ask and going along with them in certain places. But at night, he would go off and do his own thing, studying the Jujutsu High barriers as well as other barriers placed throughout the school. He would study up on different things and researching on the Six Eyes and cursed energy and more about ReUp and Sukuna, realizing that the Jujutsu High School has a lot of knowledge about Jujutsu sorcery in general. Eventually, Yuji and his classmates will eventually be sent on a mission to go investigate a juvenile detention center. Gojo would tell Yuji, Megami, and Nobara that they were going to be sent there because Gojo had something really important to do. As they would get there, they would touch bases with Ijichi, where Yuji would continue to play along with them. Ijichi would tell the group that if they were ever to encounter the special grade curse that was known to be inside of the juvenile detention center, they should run for it. They shouldn't try to fight it, they should simply run. The whole group would agree as they would enter the juvenile detention center. As they would enter, Yuji would notice that the entire area around them had changed, realizing that they must be in an innate domain. But Megami would speak up about it first. Yuji would act terrified with Nobara calling him a wuss. But Megami would calm Yuji down, saying that since he had his demon dogs nearby, his demon dogs would be able to sniff out the exit if ever needed. They were going to continue their mission and investigate on what was going on throughout here. Yuji would have a sigh of relief, realizing that everything might be okay after all. As they would continue walking down the corridor, they would reach the main hall where they saw a mutilated body. Yuji would say that it was disgusting and gross, but just then, Megami would tell Yuji that this was probably the better side of Jujutsu sorcery. Nobara would then speak up, saying that if this was the better side of Jujutsu sorcery, she didn't want to see what the worst side was. Just then, Nobara would then begin to fall through the floor. Megami would look over and be confused, as he would be confused on how they didn't pick up the cursed spirit. But then he'd look over to the other side and notice that his demon dog's head was inside of a wall. He would get on guard and yell at Yuji. He would tell them that they might need to run because a special grade cursed spirit could be in here. But before Megami could think of anything else, the special grade cursed spirit would appear before Megami and Yuji. Both Megami and Yuji would be frozen in fear, as a special grade cursed spirit would attempt to swipe at Megami, but Yuji would push him out the way. With the special grade cursed spirit slicing off his hand, Megami would scream for Yuji, telling him that they need to get out, but Yuji would tell Megami that he just needs to run. He'll hold off the special grade for right now, and that he needs to go get help from the teachers. Megami would tell Yuji that he wasn't going to leave him behind. However, Yuji would tell Megami that he doesn't need to worry about him, and that he needs to go get help, otherwise it'll spell trouble for all three of them. Megami would reluctantly listen and tell him that he'd better not die, and that if he dies he's going to kill him himself. Yuji would snicker in his head at such a cliche line. However, Megami would then summon Nue, attempting to find Kugisaki and find the outside so they could get help. However, the second Megami was to leave, Yuji would drop his act. He would look towards the special grade curse spirit and say finally. He didn't think he was ever gonna go away. Yuji would then use reverse curse technique on his hand, healing it up. He would then look at the cursed spirit and say that he wants to run a few experiments on it, so if the cursed spirit could follow in suit and not make things difficult for Yuji, everything would be fine. Yuji wanted to know exactly how this thing was considered a special grade. Yuji would then start to unsuppress his cursed energy and tell the curse to come at him with everything that it's got. As the curse would begin to smile, it would sprint straight towards Yuji, getting right in front of him and throwing a punch. However, to the cursed spirit's surprise, just standing close to Yuji alone was doing a lot of damage. His cursed energy was like it was concentrated to a single point, and there was an immense amount of it as well. Yuji's cursed energy trait felt as if it was a crushing pressure, leaving the cursed energy way too weak to stand. Yuji was going to take as much time as he could dissecting this cursed spirit and figuring out how it operates. Is a special grade cursed spirit like you made of an abundant mass of cursed energy, or are there other things in play? How do you just come to exist and be this strong? There was so much Yuji wanted to know. The cursed spirit would then begin to scream, letting off a huge wave of cursed energy. Yuji would tell the cursed spirit to not make too much noise. As the cursed spirit was pushed to the ground, Yuji would lace his finger with cursed energy, cutting into the cursed spirit to figure out its anatomy and everything else. While the cursed spirit was alive, Yuji would continue to dig around inside of it, gaining as much information as he could on cursed spirits and how they operate. He would then also realize that there was one of Sukuna's fingers inside of the cursed spirit as well, doing the same exact thing that he did to the other finger before. Yuji would extract the cursed energy that was inside of the finger into himself, basically exercising the cursed spirit without even meaning to. Yuji would be upset at the fact that the cursed spirit died in such a way. He wanted to experiment a little more, hoping the cursed spirit would have been able to keep its form even after extracting the cursed energy. Resuppressing his cursed energy, Yuji would then begin to come up with a plan. Over where Megami was, he would have saved Kugasaki and they would have been making their way towards the exit with Megami's other demon dog. However, the innate domain that they were in would collapse, with Megami realizing that Yuji may have defeated the cursed spirit. He would tell Kugasaki that they need to go back and figure out what happened to Yuji. Because the innate domain had fell, they would rush back over to where Yuji was. However, all they would see was Yuji's body and a finger next to him. Yuji's body would be on the floor with a hole through his torso. Megami would sit there and begin to get upset. He told Yuji not to get himself killed, but that's exactly what happened. He couldn't believe how stupid he was. He knew he shouldn't have let Yuji fight the cursed spirit alone. However, he couldn't have just let Kugasaki die either. Either way, somebody was going to die. Megami couldn't stand it though. He just wished he was strong enough to save both of them without any of them dying. Megami would then begin to pick up Yuji's body, as they would take him outside and report everything to Ichichi. With Ichichi being surprised that a first year died, they would have to report this back to the higher-ups and Gojo himself. As the group would get back to Jujutsu High, saying that he believed that the higher-ups knew that this would happen, telling himself that he should probably kill all of them now. However, unknown to anybody, Yuji was located deep below the main building of Jujutsu High. He was going to make this area his base of operations without being noticed by anybody. Now that everyone believes he's dead, he's able to stay here freely and study Jujutsu High School, operating from the shadows, and eventually, when the time comes, he was going to break this barrier that was inside of the Tomb of the Star Corridor. It was such a complex barrier that changes every second. Yuji couldn't wait to figure it out, break through it, and figure out who's behind it or what's behind it. It was only a matter of time for Yuji, and that was all he had right now. Yuji would have made the underground of the Jujutsu High School his base of operations, for now at least. His main goal at the moment was to figure out how the Jujutsu High School barrier operated, and who was the one operating it. It was an extremely complex barrier that changes at every given second, so he was sure to figure it out. However, he would simply wait and make his base of operations in the outskirts of the Tomb of the Star Corridor. His whole goal for right now was to simply research, so that's exactly what he would do. Day after day, Yuji would continue his research in cursed energy and figure out more ways on how he could go throughout the barrier. Although it was extremely difficult, due to the fact that the barrier was ever changing, Yuji for the life of him couldn't figure out how it worked. Whoever or whatever made this barrier was extremely advanced in barrier techniques. Yuji wanted to learn from them, or at least figure out how it works. As another week would pass, Yuji would then figure out that there was a backwards entrance, one that bypasses the ever-changing barriers. Yuji would be confused on why there was a back way, especially one that bypasses the ever-changing barriers. It seemed more like a flaw than anything. He would think to himself then that he guesses not everyone is perfect. As Yuji would walk down the corridor, he would notice there would be a taller shed. In the corner of his eye, he would look towards it, and he could feel it. The presence of Sukuna's fingers were inside of there, as well as numerous other cursed objects. He would come to the revelation that this could be the Jujutsu High School's storage, where they put all of their cursed objects, and it would make sense for them to put it down here. And this must be why there was a background. In order for Jujutsu High School higher up and or faculty to be able to retrieve these items and or put them here, he would think it was stupid. However, due to the fact that they were all in one place, someone could easily come in here and take them if they really wanted to. However, for now, Yuji would simply continue his way forward. He would walk down the corridor, where the area around him would seem to fade to white. He would then turn around and realize the entire area around him was completely white. The complex barrier he was once trying to break through, he was now in and surrounded by. Yuji wouldn't panic, however. He would simply scan his surroundings. Just then, Yuji could hear a voice behind him. Tengen would speak up and welcome Yuji in. Welcome, the one who knows all. Yuji would raise an eyebrow at this. What does she mean, the one who knows all? She would tell Yuji that she's happy to see another face here, especially one that's not out of her head. However, he does not belong here. Yuji would simply laugh and say that he wanted to figure out how the barrier worked, and that he's not going to bother anybody or hurt anyone as long as no one gets in his way. He simply wants to do more research on Sukuna's fingers and other cursed objects and figure out more about barrier techniques. It was something he had always been interested in. Tengen would begin to laugh and tell Yuji that he didn't need to fake his death in order to do this, that he could have came down here regularly. Yuji would tell Tengen he just didn't want anybody breathing down his neck because they all viewed him as a monster nonetheless. He simply wanted a space where he could do his research in peace. Tengen would then tell Yuji that he might not want to do his research here at Jujutsu High because eventually, even if she doesn't say anything, someone will figure out that he's here. Yuji would smile and say that he plans on it when the time is right to reveal himself once more. He just needs time to work on everything that he wants to by himself. Tengen would then ask Yuji, what is it exactly that he wants to work on? What would be so important that he would risk himself by staying within the barriers of Jujutsu High? Yuji would then tell Tengen that he simply wants to become the best version of himself. Cursed energy, cursed spirits, Jujutsu sorcery itself. He wants to be at the pinnacle of it both. Jujutsu sorcerers are born simply to die in his eyes, and he doesn't see any right to that. It's pointless. People awaken their cursed energy for a majority of people to not even reach grade 1, and then they die. And the first thing Yuji thought about was the thoughts of one Jujutsu sorcerer, this being Geto Suguru. If they were to make a world where only Jujutsu sorcerers exist, cursed spirits would cease to exist. However, the thought of that was simply too barbaric. Yuji doesn't want to needlessly kill people, especially innocents who have nothing to do with anything. And on top of that, non-sorcerers also die to cursed spirits and other things of the like, so it's not even their fault. Tengen would then ask Yuji, what does he plan on doing then? Yuji would put his hand on his chin, thinking. He would then tell Tengen that he simply wants to do research and figure out an efficient way to reduce the amount of cursed spirits and make it so Jujutsu sorcerers don't have to sacrifice themselves while also becoming the best version of himself. Tengen would laugh and ask Yuji does he simply want to become the background hero. Yuji would question Tengen and ask her what is she talking about. Yuji doesn't want to become a hero. He doesn't want to save people. He simply wants to create the perfect world for himself. One where people like his grandfather can live in peace, and in order to do that, he has to become the perfect version of himself. Just then, both Tengen and Yuji would hear a crash not too far from where Yuji had entered the barrier. Tengen would tell Yuji it would seem that they have intruders. She would say that she wasn't expecting that, especially not anytime soon. Yuji would ask Tengen, was it a cursed spirit or a cursed user? Where Tengen would surprisingly say cursed spirit, Yuji would quickly come to the conclusion that the cursed spirit may be intelligent, because there's no way a cursed spirit would be so bold or be able to get past the barrier on its own. Yuji would tell Tengen that they were going to pause their conversation for now, and that he would be back after he figured out what this cursed spirit is. He was going to deal with them and then come back and continue his conversation with Tengen. Tengen would open the barrier and tell Yuji that she wishes him the best of luck. Yuji would let off a smile and continue walking down the corridor. Walking down the corridor, he would see the shed that he passed once, and the doors were completely torn off of them. He would walk over and see a curse with patch-like stitches on his face. Yuji would then clear his throat. This is when Mahito would turn around and be confused. He would laugh and say he thought he took care of all the security guards, but he guesses there was one more. He would say it was no matter, and that he'll kill this one just like he killed all the others. Yuji would stare off in complete disbelief. A cursed spirit who was intelligent enough to talk. This was nothing like the finger bearer curse he had fought before. This one was a lot stronger. Mahito would get up, attempting to rush at Yuji. However, just as he would get close to him, Yuji would unsuppress his cursed energy, as the pressure would begin to crush Mahito. However, surprising Yuji, it wasn't enough to bring him down to his knees. Mahito was standing completely strong through the cursed energy. However, it had stopped him in his place. Yuji would smile and say that Mahito was interesting. He would then walk around Mahito, asking him what he was exactly. Mahito would laugh and say that he wasn't going to tell Yuji anything. However, Mahito would still be confused. Who was this guy, and why was he so strong? The second this guy flared his cursed energy, Mahito couldn't move at all.
Yuji would then tell Mahito that he was going to figure out one way or another, so it would be better if he made it easier on both of them. Mahito would snicker to himself, knowing that Yuji probably couldn't do any actual damage to him, not knowing if Yuji could perceive the contours of his soul. Yuji would then do something unexpected. He would stop flaring his cursed energy and allow Mahito to be free. He would then begin to speak to Mahito, telling him that in his few months of being in Jujutsu High, he has learned a lot. So he would like to cut a deal with Mahito, or in Jujutsu terms, he would like to set up a binding vow with Mahito. Mahito would be confused on why Yuji would want to make a binding vow with him. However, Mahito would go along with Yuji. Yuji would tell Mahito that he wants to learn more about him, saying that he is an intelligent cursed spirit, one that can speak, and one that's probably plotted to come inside the Jujutsu barrier in order to take whatever he's trying to take. Yuji wants to know what he's planning and who exactly he's planning it with. The binding vow would be as such. If Yuji could beat Mahito in a one-on-one, seeing as he was pretty sure Mahito was a special grade cursed spirit, Mahito would tell him everything that he knows. And in exchange, if Yuji is to lose here, he would make sure Mahito and all of his allies were to get out of here safely. Yuji would tell Mahito that he's very experienced in barrier techniques, and that just from leaving from Tengen's whereabouts, he's noticed that they created a veil over Jujutsu High School. Mahito would laugh and call Yuji an idiot. He would tell Yuji that they already have someone that can get them out of this, alive and intact. They don't need the help from some outsider that may not even be helping them. Mahito would then tell Yuji if he continued to stand in his way, he was simply going to kill him. Yuji would simply stare at Mahito and tell him that he shouldn't be so reckless. But just in the next second, Mahito would rush towards Yuji, attempting to use idle transfiguration on him. Yuji would attempt to back up. However, Mahito would have already touched him. Just then, Yuji's body would then begin to contort violently, turning into an amalgamation of flesh. Mahito would then begin to laugh. He would say that Yuji talked tough for someone who was that weak. However, from behind Mahito, Yuji would speak up and ask Mahito, who's weak? As Mahito would be confused, he would turn around, still seeing the amalgamation of flesh on the floor. Then he would turn back towards Yuji, even more confused. He would stare at Yuji and say that he just killed him. How was he alive? Yuji would simply say that he didn't kill him. That was his curse technique. As the body behind Mahito would then shatter, Yuji would then tell Mahito that he should have taken his proposal, and that he was really trying to take it easy on him. However, seeing an intelligent cursed spirit with a technique he doesn't understand, Mahito would become a lab rat for Yuji. Based off the single interaction that Mahito had with Yuji, he would come to a conclusion. Usually, a cursed spirit would die or be crushed under the pressure of Yuji's cursed energy. However, Mahito didn't seem to take any damage at all. However, he was still being crushed by said cursed energy. Mahito is able to heal his body without any visible damage. Therefore, Yuji needs to figure out a way to attack his soul instead of his body. Being aware of one's soul, how does one do so? Yuji would then speak out to Mahito and ask him, does his technique target the soul instead of the body itself? If so, how do you see such souls? Mahito would be shocked, realizing that Yuji realized what his technique was in a single instance. On top of that, Mahito couldn't trust anything that was around him. He didn't know if Yuji was able to simply make clones, or it was something else entirely. Yuji still hadn't explained his curse technique to him. However, Yuji would tell Mahito that he was going to make this quick, so he didn't need to worry about anything. Yuji would make a barrier around Mahito, the exact same size of his body, holding him in place. On top of that, he would stack 10 more barriers, making them as close to each other as possible. Mahito would be shocked once again. He wasn't able to move. He was confined in a small space, completely conformed around his body, and no matter how hard he tried to move, he simply couldn't. Yuji would then ask Mahito once again, what are his plans and who is he working with? Mahito would tell Yuji that he still wasn't going to tell him anything. To Mahito's understanding, Yuji still wasn't able to actually deal damage to him. Just then, Yuji would begin to flare his cursed energy once more, beginning to crush Mahito. As he was inside the barriers and being crushed at the same time, the pressure he was feeling was absolutely immense. Yuji would begin to laugh and ask Mahito if he believes he can withstand any attack, then let's see how long you can withstand this for.
Yuji would begin to exert more energy from his body as the pressure on Mahito would begin crushing him, even more than it already was. Mahito could feel his body being vaporized as he would simply reshape himself over and over. However, Mahito would then realize that this was simply a battle of attrition. If Mahito was to run out of cursed energy before Yuji was, he wouldn't be able to reshape his soul anymore. He would effectively die, but at the same time, he could have more cursed energy than Yuji and outlast him. However, Yuji would then just speak up. He would begin to tell Mahito that if he believes he can withstand his attack, that's great for him. However, Yuji is barely using any cursed energy at all, so he could probably do this for another week or so. And he has all the time in the world, but does Mahito have the time? Mahito would then understand the situation he's in, not being able to move and being crushed under the pressure of Yuji's cursed energy. Eventually, he was going to run out of cursed energy and he was going to die. He would then begin to scream out, asking Yuji if they could try something else. Mahito would tell him everything he wants to know. Yuji would stop the flow of his cursed energy and say that that was very good. However, just like Yuji said before, since Mahito didn't want to take up the binding vow, he was going to become a lab rat. Yuji was going to make use of Mahito and his technique because there were numerous things he wanted to do. He would then begin to drag Mahito, as Mahito would begin to scream out, yelling at Yuji, telling him to wait. But Yuji simply wouldn't listen and continued dragging him towards Tengen's barrier, messing up Kenjaku's plan altogether. Yuji didn't realize, but Kenjaku had sent Mahito in there in order for him to steal Sukuna's fingers. However, with Yuji capturing Mahito, everything would begin to go awry. Kenjaku had already created another vessel for Sukuna, and they needed to gather as many fingers as they could for him. So while the Kyoto Sister School event was happening, Kenjaku would have sent Hanami to distract the students, as well as numerous cursed users. But Kenjaku would be surprised when Mahito did not come back. He would have told the others that they need to get out of there immediately, as the plan has backfired and they all need to retreat for now. Kenjaku would be beyond confused, knowing what Mahito's technique was, and on top of that, he needed Mahito in order for later plans down the line. What could have happened to Mahito? Who could have stopped Mahito? Was it Tengen? He didn't know at all. However, Yuji down below would begin interrogating Mahito some more. Every chance Yuji got, he would begin to crush Mahito under the pressure of his cursed energy, torturing him and asking him questions, where Mahito would tell him about Kenjaku's plans and what they planned on doing, telling him that Kenjaku sent Mahito down there in order to take more of Sukuna's fingers in order to feed them to the other vessel. Tengen would tell Yuji about how scary he was, realizing that Yuji had learned even more about barrier techniques in the short amount of time that he's been down here with her. It was only a matter of time before Yuji figured out how to make barrier techniques on the same level Tengen could. To Tengen, Yuji was an absolute genius, one of a kind, one whose intellect seemed to be even better than Sukuna's, which to Tengen was absolutely frightening. Someone who knows and understands Jujutsu sorcery like this is a problem, but as long as Yuji doesn't go down the same path Sukuna goes, everything should be okay. But she still didn't know what Yuji's goals were. He never explained them outright. She knows that Yuji just wants to sit back and hang in the shadows for a while. But what does he plan on doing when he eventually re-emerges himself? For now, however, Tengen would just continue to try to keep Yuji with his head on straight and try not to lead him down a path where the Jujutsu world will crumble. Within the weeks to come, Yuji would learn more about Kenjaku's plan and what he intends on doing, learning that Kenjaku has another vessel that has already consumed 6 of Sukuna's fingers. Yuji would wonder what exactly is Kenjaku planning. He knows he probably didn't tell Mahito everything, but from what he could put together, creating another vessel that could house Sukuna must have been a task and a half for Kenjaku, seeing as Yuji was supposed to be the original vessel. So Yuji would tell Mahito this. He would cut another binding vow with him. He would allow Mahito to take every single cursed object that was inside the Jujutsu High inventory. However, Mahito will show Yuji where Kenjaku's hideout is. He has a deal he would like to cut with Kenjaku. Mahito, simply just wanting to get out of there, would agree to the terms of the binding vow immediately. Yuji would put a big smile on his face, telling Mahito that he's glad he's thought about it this time. He would release the barriers that were around Mahito and tell him not to do anything reckless, seeing that he's contracted to a binding vow right now. Mahito would scoff and tell Yuji that he's lucky. Yuji would simply laugh and say that he's not lucky at all. Tengen would then speak up and tell Yuji that she can't allow him to take the fingers and other cursed objects that were inside the Jujutsu High inventory. She would sound the alarm if anything were to happen. Yuji would then turn around and look at Tengen, simply smiling at her, and Tengen would immediately understand. She would let Yuji go on with Mahito, as Mahito would do exactly as the binding vow entailed. He would take the special grade objects that were inside the Jujutsu High inventory, and immediately after that, Yuji would make sure him and Mahito were able to get out of the Jujutsu High School barrier without being detected at all. Mahito would lead Yuji back to where Kenjaku's hideout was, as Kenjaku and the other cursed spirit would be inside the innate domain trying to figure out what their next move is going to be. However, just then, the door would open, with Kenjaku and all the other cursed spirits staring at the door. Seeing Mahito walk through, Kenjaku would be confused and ask Mahito how the hell did he get back. He thought Mahito was dead or something else had happened. He wasn't sure. Just then, he would see another person behind Mahito, this being Yuji. Kenjaku would immediately get on guard, asking Mahito what the hell is he doing bringing another person here. But Yuji would speak up, telling Kenjaku not to be so concerned. He's not here to fight right now. He just wants to know what Kenjaku has planned. Kenjaku would raise an eyebrow, laughing at Yuji, telling him that it was stupid of him to walk into enemy territory demanding things. On top of that, why would he just say his plans to Yuji when he doesn't trust him not one bit? Kenjaku would then think to himself, he wasn't stupid, so he knew that Yuji had to have been strong in order to cull Mahito in order for him to do this. But the question was Yuji weaker than him? He doubts someone that weak would confidently walk into the enemy territory, demanding things on top of that. Yuji would then begin to smile and tell Kenjaku that he really doesn't have all day. Yuji honestly wants to make a proposal with Kenjaku. Yuji would tell Kenjaku that he's currently residing inside of the Jujutsu High School right now. However, he's not residing as a student. They currently believe he is dead, so he's free to do whatever he wants inside the Jujutsu High School as long as he isn't caught by them. That's how he was able to capture Mahito, and he generously allowed him to leave with the special grade objects that he assumes Kenjaku wants. Kenjaku would then raise an eyebrow once again, asking Yuji what does he mean he's residing inside of the Jujutsu High barrier. Yuji would tell Kenjaku that he met someone named Tengen, and he's been there for a while now, learning more about barrier techniques and more about Jujutsu sorcery in general. He would then tell Kenjaku that he's grateful for Mahito coming to Jujutsu High in the first place. He was able to learn something even more advanced, protecting one's soul and seeing the contours of one. Cursed spirits and Jujutsu sorcerers work fundamentally different, their ideals and the way they operate entirely. It's fascinating to Yuji. Yuji would tell Kenjaku that he has nothing to hide from him, as he does not see Kenjaku as a threat. The only ones that are really a threat to him are Gojo Satoru and maybe Sukuna, seeing that Yuji knows that Kenjaku had already created another vessel. Yuji would then scan the room and ask Kenjaku, where's this new vessel anyway? Just then, there would be someone who looked almost identical to Yuji, but instead of having his pink hair, he would have black hair and red eyes. He would tell Yuji that he had a lot of gall coming into enemy territory like this. Yuji would simply plainly speak out loud and ask him who he was, as the man would lift his finger, sending a slash directly towards Yuji. However, Yuji would flare his cursed energy, with the slash just falling short. He would tell Yuji to know his place talking to him, and that he's lucky he's only at 6 fingers. Yuji would then begin to have a humongous smile on his face. You must be the actual king of curses, Ryomen Sukuna, reborn in the flesh. Yuji would walk up to Sukuna, asking Kenjaku what exactly does he get out of making another vessel and allowing Sukuna to be awakened early. If the Jujutsu higher-ups, or anyone in that matter, were to find out that Sukuna was reincarnated, you'd have a really bad time. Kenjaku would ask Yuji why was he stalling, and to simply get to the point. Yuji would tell Kenjaku that he simply wanted to know his plan. He may be able to help him in the long run, if anything. Yuji isn't exactly on the sides of the Jujutsu sorcerer. He's doing whatever he wants, simply because it's fun. Kenjaku would then laugh a bit, realizing that Yuji may be more like him than he initially thought. Kenjaku would then speak up. He would tell Yuji, then how about this? They would be able to cut a binding vow, but Yuji would immediately cut him off, saying that he's not going to cut any type of binding vow. He allowed Mahito to leave Jujutsu High with the fingers and other special grade cursed objects. Yuji would then walk over to Mahito as he would put his hand out. Mahito, realizing what Yuji was trying to do, would immediately hand him all the special grade objects, with Kenjaku being confused as to why Mahito would easily give up the fingers and other special grade objects like that. Yuji would then walk over to Kenjaku, as he would tell Kenjaku that they were going to be experimentation buddies. Yuji wanted to learn a lot more about Sukuna's fingers and cursed energy in general. Special grade cursed objects, they carry a whole bunch of cursed energy. However, Yuji's learned how to siphon that energy out of special grade cursed objects without extracting the soul that's inside of the cursed object. He would then tell Kenjaku that he has already done it with at least 2 of Sukuna's fingers. This is when Sukuna would speak up, sending more slashes at Yuji. However, they would fall short once more. He would begin to ask everyone, why are they so afraid of this boy? If anything, there are 7 of them against this one measly boy. Why are they afraid? Kenjaku would then realize that Sukuna might be right. There are 7 of them, with all of them being at least special grade. Yuji would smile and tell all of them to not be so hasty. Sukuna would then speak up once more. He would tell Yuji that he's going to rip the fingers from his corpse, and after he does that, he'll take his fingers and consume them. Yuji would simply begin to laugh and tell all of them that it's a shame that they all think he's so weak. If anything, he would instantly kill half of the cursed spirits here, and then immediately go after Kenjaku. Seeing as Sukuna was only 6 fingers, Yuji didn't deem him a threat at all. He would tell them all that if they really wanted to test their luck, they could. However, Yuji wouldn't hold back at all. Yuji would tell the group that he's not much one for fighting. However, if it will come down to it, he doesn't mind getting his hands bloody. He would tell them he simply came here to make a proposal to maybe help them out. Just then, Yuji would realize he was completely surrounded. Jogo, Hanami, Dagon, Mahito, Kenjaku, Sukuna, and Urarame would all be around Yuji. Yuji would then laugh and say that he guesses he overstayed his welcome. He would tell Kenjaku that it's such a shame, and he really wanted to work with him. But seeing as they all fall when Sukuna says one word, there was no point in talking to them anymore, not like this at least. He was going to play along with them until he got bored. Yuji would simply smile and tell all of them to come on. And what are they waiting for? Yuji would have told everyone to come at him. Kenjaku would be taken aback by how brazen Yuji was, and he would hesitate. However, Sukuna taking up the challenge would immediately rush in, with Urarame following in suit. Urarame would use a frost calm at maximum output, attempting to cover Yuji entirely so Sukuna could follow up. However, Yuji would appear behind Urarame, telling them that they need to be careful where they're throwing that attack, as Urarame would look forward and see that she had to use her technique on Sukuna instead of Yuji. Urarame would hurriedly release her technique, profusely apologizing, at the same time turning around, attempting to attack Yuji. They would attempt to throw a punch, however, Yuji would simply catch the attack, unsuppressing his cursed energy, making the energy crush Urarame in the process. Urarame would be brought to a knee, barely being able to stand, as Yuji would look up and stare at Sukuna, who is sprinting straight towards him. Sukuna would attempt to use Dismantle, however, the slashes would fall short just outside of Yuji, as Yuji would smile and ask Sukuna, was that really the best he could do? Kenjaku, not wanting to attack yet, wanted to see what Yuji could do first, so he would bide his time and wait until he either had the perfect opening or something else entirely. However, Jogo and Hanami would follow suit behind Sukuna. Hanami would use their technique, shooting a large plume of tree branches straight at Yuji. However, Yuji would simply jump up, causing Urarame to get tangled within the tree branches. However, Jogo would then quickly send ember insects straight towards Yuji. They would fly straight in front of him and begin to explode. As the dust would settle, they would see Yuji falling from the sky. With his clothes burnt, Jogo would laugh and tell Yuji that he wasn't all that, talking so big for someone that was so weak. However, Yuji would appear behind Jogo and ask him who's weak exactly. As Jogo would then catch a strong fist coming from behind him, connecting with his face, sending him flying through the innate domain. Sukuna, studying Yuji's technique, would then realize something. He wasn't aware if Yuji was making clones or something else entirely. He would have to stay on his toes though. He was never aware of what was actually real or not. Sukuna would quickly send dismantles towards Yuji, as once again, they would fall short due to the immense pressure around Yuji. Sukuna would notice this as well. It would seem as if Yuji had his own personal barrier around him at all times, of just his cursed energy that was protecting him. Cursed techniques would simply fall short of Yuji's presence. Yuji would begin to laugh and say that he guesses Sukuna is the king of curses for a reason. He was able to almost figure out his curse technique by just a glance. It was funny, truly. Sukuna would begin to laugh and tell Yuji that he guesses Yuji isn't all talk. After all, he would have died, yet he's lasted this long so far. Sukuna wants to know exactly what Yuji could do, so he's going to push Yuji. Kenjaku, already realizing what Sukuna was about to do, would tell everyone that they should probably leave. Things were about to get crazy. Everyone would rush away as Sukuna would clasp his hands together, saying the words domain expansion. Yuji would watch as the innate domain would change completely, and Sukuna's domain would then begin to erupt. Yuji would begin laughing and saying that this was absolutely interesting. Just then, the area around Yuji would begin to get sliced. However, once again, every slash that was directed towards Yuji would immediately fall short. Sukuna would be absolutely shocked by this. Yuji wasn't using simple domain or hollow wicker basket. However, there was a constant barrier on his body of cursed energy pressure alone. What could this possibly be? Yuji would begin laughing once more, telling Sukuna that he would have to do a lot more than just this if he wanted to beat Yuji. Yuji would then begin to ask Sukuna, is this really all the King of Curses has? As Sukuna would begin to get irritated, asking the boy if he dare mocks him, he'll show him why he was regarded as the strongest. Sukuna would immediately rush in at Yuji, domain still activated. Throwing attack after attack, he would throw a right. However, Yuji would duck underneath it. With his hands in his pocket, Yuji would then sweep at Sukuna's legs. However, Sukuna would jump over it, sending a knee straight towards Yuji's face. Yuji would duck backwards, flipping over the attack, as Sukuna would attempt to follow up, throwing a punch straight towards Yuji's gut. Yuji would take his hand out of his pocket, blocking the attack, while smiling. Yuji would then take his other hand out of his pocket, throwing down an elbow, as Sukuna would throw his hands up to block the attack. Yuji would then use his feet, pulling them up to push himself off Sukuna, making some space between the both of them. However, Sukuna wasn't going to let Yuji get any type of breathing room. He would close in the distance once more. As Sukuna would place his hand onto Yuji's arm, he would then use cleave. As this time, the barrier wasn't enough for Yuji to deflect the attack. His arm would be cleaved in half. As Sukuna would begin smiling, telling Yuji, was this enough for him? Yuji would simply smile and say that this was plenty. Sukuna would attempt to do the same thing once more, reaching for Yuji's torso. However, Yuji would deflect the attack with one of his legs, creating more space. As just then, Yuji would erupt a barrier around Sukuna and his domain, telling Sukuna that he studied barrier techniques for a while. And even though Sukuna is a master in Jujutsu sorcery, he doesn't believe that Sukuna knows anything about this. Imbuing a barrier with his own curse technique would allow the pressure inside to continuously build up. It's not exactly a domain, however, it's along the same lines, just extremely smaller. Sukuna would then smile as the pressure inside of the barrier would continue to get stronger and stronger. As Sukuna's domain would then begin to collapse, crushing under the weight of the pressure, as Sukuna himself would be brought to a knee. Yuji would take a deep breath as he would begin to use RCT on his arm, telling Sukuna that he might be strong. However, Yuji is simply stronger. Sukuna would then begin to laugh and tell Yuji that the only reason he's able to do any of this to him right now is simply because he doesn't have all 20 of his fingers. If Sukuna was to consume all 20 of his fingers, he would easily put Yuji in his place. Yuji would laugh once more and tell Sukuna that he still wasn't using all of his strength. The only reason Sukuna took off his arm is because Yuji wanted to feel the effects of the attack, nothing more. Understanding Sukuna's technique, that's all he wanted to get out of their little scuffle. Just then, out of nowhere once more, Urame would attempt to use Frost Calm once more at Yuji. However, Yuji once more would jump up out of the attack, landing on the ice, telling Urame that they'd better not get in his way because he doesn't want to waste his energy on a nobody. Urame would get mad, attempting to send yet another Frost Calm towards Yuji. As Yuji would appear right in front of Urame, he would punch Urame in their gut, landing a black flash as Urame would fly across the innate domain, crashing into the walls of it. Yuji would look down at his hand, gripping his fist, as he would then begin to smile. He's been trying to land one of those since their fight first started. He would then turn back to see the other cursed spirits plus Kenjaku staring at him. He would then ask, do they still want to continue? Because Yuji is more than ready to continue. Kenjaku studying the area would realize Sukuna was inside a barrier, being crushed by the pressure of Yuji's cursed energy. Urame was taking out in a single punch, even though it was a black flash, and Yuji still has more than enough energy to continue fighting all of them. Kenjaku would put up his hands and tell Yuji that maybe it's best that they talk after all. Yuji's smile would then turn into a frown. He would tell Kenjaku that after all of that, now they want to talk. Yuji's not really in the mood to talk anymore. He's having fun, and he's never felt like this ever in his entire life. Kenjaku would then ask Yuji if they could create a binding vow instead of fighting. Asking Yuji if they can continue their conversation from earlier, Kenjaku is willing to listen, and no one else will attack. Kenjaku, realizing how strong Yuji is, wasn't going to take any more chances. If he were to lose any of the cursed spirits that he has right now, all of his plans would go to waste. And on top of that, Yuji has the fingers of Sukuna, plus other cursed objects that would help them out. If they get on Yuji's bad side, Sukuna will never be fully incarnated, and Kenjaku's 1,000-year plan will go to waste. He simply couldn't afford it. Yuji would let off a long sigh and tell Kenjaku fine. He would release his barrier on Sukuna. However, Sukuna would immediately get up, attempting to rush at Yuji once more. Yuji would begin to smile as he would put the barrier around Sukuna once more. The sudden pressure put back on Sukuna would cause him to fall forward, as Yuji would immediately follow up in front of Sukuna, sending a strong uppercut as it would connect with Sukuna's chin, landing yet another black flash. As it would knock Sukuna out right here and there, Yuji would begin to laugh once more, saying that Sukuna is quite the character. He'd 100% be willing to give Kenjaku the fingers of Sukuna. However, there are some things he wants in exchange. Yuji would then begin to stare darts into Kenjaku. He would begin to tell Kenjaku that he's willing to make a binding vow with him. Yuji would grab the fingers of Sukuna, holding them out, as he would tell Kenjaku that every time Kenjaku does something for Yuji or helps him out with an experiment, he will be willing to give exactly one of Sukuna's fingers to him. Right now, Yuji has a grand total of 10 of Sukuna's fingers, so that's exactly 10 favors Kenjaku will do for Yuji. If not, Yuji will simply kill Kenjaku and figure everything out himself. Yuji would begin to smile menacingly, asking Kenjaku what was he going to do. Kenjaku would let off a nervous smile, realizing that he messed up big time. If he would have realized Yuji's potential from the very beginning, he would have known that he would have made the perfect vessel for Sukuna. However, it's come down to this. Kenjaku would then scratch the back of his head, telling Yuji that he'll accept these terms, as the binding vow would now be in motion. Yuji would then smile, saying that was great, and the first thing that Kenjaku was going to help Yuji figure out was exactly how he was able to turn things into cursed objects. Yuji knew that Kenjaku was a person that taught Sukuna on how to turn himself into a cursed object due to learning a lot from Tengen. Kenjaku would then tell Yuji that he doesn't know how to turn someone into a cursed object. He only knows how to turn himself into a cursed object, or teach someone how to turn themselves into a cursed object. Yuji would then laugh and tell Kenjaku, does he not think the other can be applied? Forcefully turning someone into a cursed object, do you think it could be possible? Kenjaku would begin to laugh in his own head, saying that Yuji might be even more crazier than him. Kenjaku would tell Yuji that it absolutely could be possible, but he wouldn't know. Yuji would laugh and tell Kenjaku then it's a good thing that they're going to figure out together. He would tell Kenjaku that as long as he has any form of Sukuna's fingers, Kenjaku would do exactly what he says, and Yuji won't get in his way at all. He's not really planning on showing himself to the Jujutsu Society anytime soon, so he doesn't want to get in the way of his plans. Yuji would tell Kenjaku that he already knows what Kenjaku is planning, since Mahito had told him that they were planning on sealing Satoru Gojo. However, he would tell Kenjaku that, if anything, Yuji would be able to help him with that as well, and at the same time, no one will have to lose their life either. No cursed spirits or humans. Kenjaku would raise his eyebrow, asking Yuji what exactly does he mean. Yuji would tell Kenjaku that he knows he's willing to sacrifice people to get his plan completed. However, Yuji isn't that type of person. Innocent people shouldn't have to die, nor should Jujutsu sorcerers or curses. As much as he knows Kenjaku wants to create a new world, or technically the old world, Kenjaku's plan is stupid. Many people will die, sorcerers and cursed spirits. It was absolutely pointless on both sides. Yuji doesn't necessarily care about saving people. The only thing Yuji cares about is creating a world where people like his grandfather could live in peace, and that world could be created if Yuji becomes the perfect version of himself. He would tell Kenjaku to not think about merging humanity with Tengen, and that Yuji would merge himself with Tengen. Kenjaku would raise an eyebrow and ask Yuji what is he talking about. Yuji knows that Kenjaku probably plans on using the new body that he has in order to capture Tengen, and in doing so he would be able to use Tengen and force evolve Tengen by merging humanity with Tengen. Kenjaku would be appalled. His 1,000-year plan was figured out just like that.
Yuji would then continue telling Kenjaku that he shouldn't merge Tengen with anyone else. If he teaches Yuji on how to make something into a cursed object or figure out how to turn someone into a cursed object, he could potentially do that with Tengen. However, the only downside to it is that he would need enough cursed energy to do something like that. And even though Yuji has an abundant amount of cursed energy, he just doesn't think he has enough to do that. Forcing evolution on himself is quite the big task, and he knows that even if he was to absorb Tengen, it would be more like a Sukuna thing, and if Tengen was the one to take control, then it would all be for nothing. Yuji would begin to smile and tell Kenjaku that if they really wanted to, they could both figure out how to turn Tengen into a cursed object instead of using Geto's ability. They could either separate Tengen's soul or nullify their soul completely, turning Tengen into simply a form of evolution. Merging that with themselves, who knows what will happen. However, at the same time, they would need an abundant amount of cursed energy to do exactly that. Kenjaku would begin to smile menacingly, telling Yuji that he has a plan for that already, and that he would simply have to trust Kenjaku. Yuji would begin to laugh, telling Kenjaku that that was impossible. However, he was going to go along with Kenjaku, for now at least. He would then tell Kenjaku that Yuji will help them on capturing Satoru Gojo, and after that, they will start Kenjaku's plan, or whatever he has planned. However, Yuji wants to be around while Kenjaku is starting it. Otherwise, Yuji will kill Kenjaku and disrupt everything he has going on. Kenjaku would let off a nervous laugh, telling Yuji that he swears he won't do it. Yuji would put a thumbs up and tell Kenjaku that he's smart. He would then give Kenjaku one of Sukuna's fingers, as he would then put barriers around Mahito once more, telling Kenjaku that he wanted to take Mahito with him, just so he could study Mahito's technique and what it does to the soul, as well as figuring out how to perceive the contours of his own soul, and he believes Mahito is the perfect plan for that. Yuji would then ask Kenjaku when exactly do they plan on sealing Satoru Gojo, as Kenjaku would tell Yuji on October 31st they were going to put veils over Shibuya and do it. Yuji would then smile, waving off Kenjaku as he would begin to walk away, grabbing Mahito, dragging him along with him. He would tell Kenjaku that he'll see him on October 31st. He'll be the one to take care of Gojo so that he can be sealed. He doesn't want to fight a monster like that. Yuji knows even though he's strong, there's nothing he could do against Gojo, for now at least. Yuji would take his leave, as Kenjaku would let off a long sigh. He would begin to tell himself that this was absolutely insane. He can't believe he messed up so badly. The vessel he made prior to making the new one was even more perfect than he thought it was. He would begin to laugh maniacally, as Sukuna would finally wake up. Sukuna would look around confused, asking Kenjaku what the hell happened. Kenjaku would simply tell Sukuna that he lost to Yuji. He got hit with a black flash and got knocked out. Sukuna would then grow a vein on his forehead, as Kenjaku would then toss him a finger, telling him that Yuji had left this for him. This would begin to utterly piss Sukuna off. He couldn't believe at all that a brat like him was able to completely overpower him. Sukuna would then begin to scream out, saying that he can't wait. The moment he collects all of his fingers, he will put the brat in his place. He will kill him, rip the skin from his flesh, and torture him slowly until he was pleading for death. And even then, he wasn't going to stop. Kenjaku would simply let off a nervous laugh, as Yuji would simply be making his way back to the Jujutsu high school, simply laughing. He couldn't wait to test Sukuna at 20 of his fingers. That version of Sukuna was pretty strong, and he only had 6 fingers inside of him. Who knows how strong Sukuna will be at 20 fingers. The king of curses. He couldn't wait to fight him. Yuji would then drag Mahito's body inside the barriers where Tengen resided. He would greet Tengen with a smile on his face, saying that he was back. Tengen would ask Yuji if he was okay, as Yuji would tell Tengen that everything was fine and that it was nothing he couldn't handle. However, there was some more experimenting he was going to do, so in the meantime, he was going to leave Tengen alone and do some of his own experiments. The death wound paintings that he took, he wants to experiment with them. He wants to see exactly what they could do, see if they were able to inhabit a body, and if anything, he would make them his minions. He was going to do the same with Mahito as well. He was going to learn how to turn something into a cursed object, and maybe he could do it with Mahito as well. There was so much he wanted to do, all for his grand plan, and he couldn't wait. Weeks would begin to pass as Yuji would continue experimenting, learning about the contours of his own soul, reincarnating the death wound paintings, combining them all into one, as the brother would call himself Choso. As Yuji would tell Choso that he combined him with all of the other death womb paintings. Yuji had noticed that there were souls residing in every last one of the death wombs. So instead of killing them off, he simply combined them all into one singular being, and Choso was the one that took over. Choso would be irritated by the fact that Yuji was tampering with him, but then would realize Yuji took into consideration that Choso had other brothers, and instead of simply killing them off or doing something else with them, he combined them into Choso so that they would always be with him. And Yuji would tell Choso that he wasn't the one that put them into that state anyway. Yuji probably knows who it is, but he'll keep his mouth shut for now. This would all lead up into the day of October 31st, where Yuji would leave the inside of the Jujutsu High barrier, as all of the Jujutsu higher-ups, plus Gojo Satoru himself, would be notified that a veil has dropped over Shibuya, and the civilians were trapped inside. They were calling for Gojo Satoru himself to come inside the veil, otherwise they were going to kill every last civilian that was inside the barrier. Gojo, hearing about it, being Gojo, would immediately step forward. He would walk himself inside of the barrier, only to see that there was no one at all inside of the barrier. Gojo would be confused and attempt to leave. However, what Gojo didn't realize is that this is exactly what Yuji and Kenjaku wanted. Then from all of a sudden, from behind Gojo, he would hear someone say, "How are you doing, teacher?" As Gojo would turn around, completely shocked, he would see Yuji. He would begin to stutter on his words, saying that he thought Yuji died. What was going on here? Yuji would then laugh and tell Gojo that technically he did die, however, not in the way that they thought he did. Gojo would then say that he knew something was off with the body, he just couldn't tell exactly what it was. Yuji would then begin laughing, saying that he didn't even believe that his technique would be able to fool Gojo's 6 eyes. But lo and behold, Gojo would then ask Yuji, what is he here for then? Was he the one that trapped him here? As Yuji would say, sorta. In order for Yuji to continue doing what he wants to do, he needs Gojo out of the picture. He's not stupid enough to attempt to challenge the Jujutsu higher-ups or the Jujutsu Society itself as long as Gojo is around. Therefore, he's going to kill Gojo right here and now. Gojo would laugh and tell Yuji that he's quite the brave student for doing this. Gojo would then immediately stop smiling, telling Yuji that he won't make the same mistake twice. Gojo would then just about teleport in front of Yuji, sending a punch straight towards his stomach. Yuji would simply smile as the punch would connect, making Yuji throw up a bit of blood as he would be blasted back into a wall. Just then, Yuji would be pinned to the wall, sliding down as he would seemingly be knocked out. Gojo would be confused. There was no way Yuji would just outright announce himself like that and be defeated that easily. Realizing that Yuji was able to create clones of himself or something of the like, he wasn't letting his guard down that easily. Just then, Yuji would say the words shatter from behind Gojo as Jogo, Hanami, Choso, Mahito, and Yuji himself would reappear. Gojo would begin to laugh and say that this was more like it. He knew that Yuji wasn't dumb enough to simply come here by himself and challenge Gojo. Yuji would simply smile, telling Gojo that he's come prepared and he's not going to let Gojo get away. After all, there's so much more Yuji needs to do, and he wasn't going to let someone like Gojo Satoru stop him. Who cares if he's titled the strongest? That day ends now. Jogo and Hanami would immediately rush in, attempting to throw a punch onto Gojo. However, they would both be stopped by Gojo's infinity. Gojo would grab both of their arms, swinging them both to the side, throwing them both, as Jogo would crash into one of the subway walls, and Hanami would fly the other way. However, Gojo would quickly follow up on Hanami, sprinting straight towards her, hitting her with a devastating combo. He would then grab onto her horns, pulling them out, as he would throw a clean strike towards Hanami's gut, crashing her into the same wall that Jogo was near. Choso would then use conversions, charging up a piercing blood attack as it would fly straight towards Gojo. However, once again, the infinity would stop the attack, but Gojo would note that that attack was insanely powerful. If Gojo didn't have infinity, that would have went straight through him. However, once again, Jogo would attempt to attack, creating volcanic heads underneath Gojo. As they would begin to erupt, the infinity would stop the volcanic heads from attacking Gojo, as Mahito would attempt to rush in, transfiguring his arms into whips, attempting to slash at Gojo. However, the infinity would stop the attack once more. Gojo would laugh and call all of them idiots. Do they not realize that they're up against someone they can't attack? They're wasting their time and energy. However, from behind Gojo, Yuji would be using domain amplification, sending attacks straight towards Gojo's chest. Surprising Gojo, the attack would land,
punching him, cracking one of his ribs in the process. Gojo would be caught off guard. He wasn't aware that Yuji knew how to use domain amplification, let alone have a way to get past his barrier. He didn't realize Yuji was as strong as he was at the moment, so that attack came to him as a surprise. He would attempt to hurry up over to Yuji to grab him. However, Choso would appear right in front of Gojo, already having a piercing blood ready to go. As he would launch the attack, the blood would fly forward, going straight towards Gojo's head. However, once again, the infinity would block the attack. However, the blood would block Gojo's view. Jogo would then activate more volcanic heads, setting them all over the place as they would fly straight towards Gojo, sending streaks of lava everywhere. Gojo would be confused. The cursed spirits knew that they weren't going to be able to attack Gojo naturally, so why were they wasting their cursed energy? They didn't have anyone else in the barrier, so what exactly was going on? He would then remember back on how Yuji is able to create clones, but were the clones only viable to himself? As Yuji would appear once again right in front of Gojo, sending a kick, using domain amplification. However, this time, Gojo was prepared. He would block the attack, grabbing onto Yuji. He would then use red at maximum output, pointing it straight towards Yuji's chest, as it would blast him, sending a hole straight through him. Yuji would be sent backwards into the wall as he would fall limp. As Gojo would walk over to him, Yuji would then appear behind Gojo, throwing another kick using domain amplification straight towards his head. As it would connect, launching Gojo to the side. Gojo would be beyond confused once more. He couldn't figure out Yuji's curse technique, even with the 6 eyes. Nothing he saw was real. His sense of smell, his touch, his eyesight, he couldn't rely on anything. He was sure he connected that attack on Yuji, however, nothing happened to Yuji. He still got attacked in his back. He wasn't even sure if Hanami, Jogo, and the others were real either. Just then, from behind Gojo, he would hear someone say hey. As he would turn around, about to attack, however, he would then see Kenjaku, or his best friend Geto. He would be lost, not understanding what was going on. Was this also a play from Yuji? He couldn't figure it out. Was this real or was it not? And if it wasn't real, how would Yuji know about Geto? Gojo wasn't able to figure it out for the life of him. But that single moment of hesitation was all it took. The prison realm would then wrap itself around Gojo. As even earlier than in the original series, Gojo Satoru would be captured by the prison realm. Kenjaku would begin laughing, telling Yuji that his plan was perfect, and that his curse technique was something crazy, as Yuji would say the word shatter once more, as all of the cursed spirits plus Choso would completely vanish, shattering like glass. Yuji would tell Kenjaku to not be so happy and that they still have more that they need to do. Gojo would then yell out, asking Yuji, what the hell is he doing? He thought Yuji was a jujutsu sorcerer. Why is he doing this? Yuji would simply turn around, look at Gojo, and smile. He would raise his hands in the air, shrugging his shoulders, telling Gojo, simply because he wants to. Gojo would have been sealed by Yuji and Kenjaku, as Kenjaku would begin laughing, telling Yuji that his plan was absolutely perfect. He couldn't imagine it going any more smoother. He would be surprised that even Gojo's 6 eyes wasn't able to pick up Yuji's technique. Originally, he thought that Yuji's technique was to simply make clones, but that wasn't the case at all. Yuji's technique was more of illusions, making it so Yuji could create absolutely anything. However, Yuji's illusions were so real, it was hard to tell, even for Gojo, what's exactly real or not. Even one's sense of smell or hearing could be changed by Yuji's technique. Even with touch, you could never know what was real around Yuji and what wasn't. However, that wasn't even the most dangerous thing about Yuji. Yuji had an almost bottomless well of cursed energy, and his intellect was ridiculous. Putting that kind of mind inside of a jujutsu sorcerer was terrifying, especially for someone like Kenjaku. He could never realize what Yuji was actually planning or what he was trying to do. Even if Yuji would outright tell Kenjaku everything, he still couldn't trust it. However, Yuji would begin laughing, telling Kenjaku that they have so much more that they need to do. This was only the beginning. Since Satoru Gojo was sealed, Yuji wants to do something. He wants to put his practice into play. He's been learning on how to turn something into a cursed object forcefully. Once they were done with everything in Shibuya, they were going to go back to the Jujutsu High headquarters and take on Tengen. Yuji was sure they'd probably have someone there protecting them. And since Satoru Gojo has been sealed, security will probably be at an all-time high, but Yuji would simply say that there was nothing they need to worry about. He's out-trumped Tengen's barrier techniques a long time ago. He would plan out with Kenjaku some more, telling him that he should set up everything here, while Yuji goes back to Jujutsu High and finishes up things there.
He would still remind Kenjaku though, that if he continued the plan without him, Yuji was simply going to kill him and ruin everything he was working for, so he'd better be smart about his decisions. Kenjaku would simply laugh and say that he wasn't going to risk his 1,000-year plan simply over Yuji not being here, as Yuji would smile. However, the Shibuya incident would be an absolute massacre on the Jujutsu sorcerer side, with no one like Yuji to help around with Mahito. Mahito would be on a rampage, turning humans to transfigured humans left and right, overwhelming the sorcerers. At the same time, this would cause the grandmother to reincarnate Toji's vessel, causing him to go on a rampage as well, killing sorcerers left and right, and then going after the cursed spirits themselves, or he would eventually fall to Mahito. However, right after that, Mahito would then fall to Kenjaku. Kenjaku would laugh as he begins absorbing Mahito, telling himself that he can't believe that his plans are going this smoothly. Sukuna is his own vessel, doing whatever he wants. His plan for Shibuya went off even smoother than he thought it was going to go. He was able to absorb Mahito easily, and even Jogo. As more sorcerers would hurry up and try to take down Kenjaku, he would use a Uzumaki on them, killing them instantly, being able to extract both Mahito's and Jogo's techniques for himself, using auto-transfiguration in a widespread area, as he would tell himself that now he simply has to wait for Yuji, and in doing so, the culling games would then start. He would summon his millions of curses and simply wait for Yuji to come back from Jujutsu High School. He would laugh as he would gather with Sukuna, giving him the finger that Yuji had gave him. He would begin to tell him that things were getting extremely interesting, and in just a few moments' time, Sukuna will be able to do whatever he wants, truly. No more having to hide behind the shadows. They had already found a couple more fingers that Yuji didn't have and fed them to Sukuna. Yuji had 5 fingers left, and he intended on holding on to them for as long as he could. He was going to make sure to use Kenjaku until he was completely sapped up and dried. He couldn't wait. Getting back to the Jujutsu High School, Yuji would have walked into the barriers of Jujutsu High, going straight to where Tengen was. As he would walk through the barriers, the room around him would be completely white. He would tell Tengen to not make this even more difficult than it needs to be, as Tengen would begin to talk to Yuji, telling him that this is not the path she intended for him to go down. Yuji would laugh and tell Tengen that the path that he wanted to go down was already set in stone, and there was nothing she or anyone could do to stop it from happening. From the moment Yuji's grandfather died, he knew exactly what he wanted to do, what he needed to do. He wasn't going to let anybody stop him, even if that meant betraying the entire Jujutsu world. This was simply for the better. Tengen would then ask Yuji what is he going to do about Tengen and Sukuna then. Yuji would tell Tengen that he has his own plans for them, and that she shouldn't overthink it. Yuji is a lot smarter than he looks, and he knows exactly what he's doing. Even though he has to sacrifice Tengen for his plans, he would hope that she would make things easier and understand this was for the greater good. However, even if she was to put up a fight, Yuji would quickly subdue her. Tengen would tell Yuji that she was disappointed in him. She thought that he was better than this, better than Kenjaku, better than whatever he was doing right now. Trying to change the world for the better, this wasn't the way to do it. There were numerous ways that he could change the world. However, the path he was currently taking wasn't something he should be doing. Asking Yuji what would his grandfather think about this. This is when Yuji would stare at Tengen, having a straight look on his face. He would stare at Tengen, telling her to keep his name out of her mouth and that she simply doesn't understand. He was doing this for everybody and not just himself. As another voice would then speak up, this being Yuki Tsukumo, telling Yuji that she doesn't even know what his plan is, but it sounds stupid. Making the perfect world. She would tell Yuji that Tengen had told her that Yuji probably intended on coming back here in order to do something with Tengen herself. Yuji would tell Yuki though to simply shut up and get out of his way. He would tell Yuki that someone like her should understand this is the only way to go about it. Yuki would tell Yuji that this may be a good plan for him, however, there were still numerous ways they could go about it. Sacrificing Tengen did not have to be one of them. Yuji would then laugh, telling Yuki that as long as he has power in the world of Jujutsu, nothing could oppose him anyway. Power is everything in the Jujutsu society. Think on how Sukuna ruled in the Heian era. Yuji would do the exact same thing, but instead of ruling on fear, it would be something completely different. An absolute authority that no one could challenge. Yuji will be that, the supreme ruler of the world, where regular people like his grandfather, cursed spirits, and Jujutsu sorcerers will simply live their lives without being sacrificial lambs to the cause. No one, especially Jujutsu sorcerers, should have to needlessly sacrifice themselves for people that can't even fathom what a cursed spirit is. And the same shouldn't happen to them either. People that have no purpose in the Jujutsu world should simply stay out of it, living their lives peacefully. Yuji would tell Yuki that his grandfather died in an unjust way due to a cursed spirit, and it was all because Kenjaku meddled in Yuji's life, and Yuji knows this. He knew this for a while. His grandfather told him a while ago. Kenjaku was the reason all of this is even happening. So it was Yuji's whole plan in life to stop Kenjaku. However, Yuji realized later in life that stopping Kenjaku wasn't going to put a stop to any of this. As long as cursed spirits and Jujutsu sorcerers continue to go neck and neck at each other, nothing will ever happen. The world would simply be in a continuation cycle of hatred, where Jujutsu sorcerers and cursed spirits kill each other unnecessarily, as well as taking out innocent lives in the process. Tengen did nothing but sit in a barrier and reinforce these Jujutsu beliefs. However, Yuji will not sit idly by and allow things like this to happen. If Yuki wants to try to stop him, by all means, she can do so. However, she will die in the process. Yuki, hearing Yuji's word, could tell he was absolutely serious. If she got in his way, she knew she would probably die, especially to someone like him. She's heard all about him from Tengen and how strong he actually is. Being the sole person to be able to seal Satoru Gojo was no easy task, as well as being able to take on at least 7 special grades by himself. Yuki may have been a special grade in her own right, but she knew and understood that Yuji was on an entirely different level. Yuji would tell Tengen that making herself a cursed object would make things a lot easier than Yuji turning her into a cursed object. It would hurt for Tengen and Yuji as well, because he doesn't want to do it. However, if he needs to, he will. He would ask Tengen one more time, would Tengen rather do this the hard way or the easy way? The choice is completely up to her. He will only forcefully go after Tengen if Tengen refuses. If not, and Tengen willingly subsides, turning themselves into a cursed object, Yuji will make sure to do everything in his power to fuse his soul with Tengen instead of completely taking it over. Working as one instead of working against each other, that's all Yuji wants to do. He would tell both of them that they heard his plan, and now they have the chance to choose. Which one was it going to be? They would all sit in silence for a while, before Tengen would eventually speak up once more. She would tell Yuji that she was willing to turn herself into a cursed object, as long as Yuji actually does what he says. Yuji would then tell Tengen that if she doesn't believe him, they could make a binding vow. However, Tengen would say that that wasn't necessary. She would tell Yuji that he may have been right. Tengen had been living her old ways, and maybe it was time for a change to happen. It wasn't as if Yuji was attempting to destroy the world like Kenjaku was. He simply wanted to make it a better place in his own ideals. Tengen would tell Yuji that she will do it, and that she hopes Yuji will stand true to his words. They both will make a better world for everyone and not just the Jujutsu sorcerers. Yuji would tell Tengen that it would take a while for her to transform herself into a cursed object, but when all is said and done, Yuji will consume her, and after that, they would go back to Kenjaku, and once Kenjaku starts the culling games, Yuji will kill Kenjaku. Yuki would be confused, thinking that Yuji was working with Kenjaku this entire time. Yuji would then laugh, saying that he never intended on working with Kenjaku. He only needed to use him as leverage, making them believe they're both working towards the same thing. If anything, he would kill Kenjaku and force him into a cursed object. Down the line, he intends on sapping the energy out of the rest of Sukuna's fingers and taking it for himself. He was going to get rid of any obstacle that was going to stand in his way. Sealing Satoru Gojo was a necessary evil, because he knew Gojo would probably stop him. However, he would then tell Yuki that once he absorbs Tengen, he wants her to follow him. He knows someone like her has been researching on how to make the world or the Jujutsu society a better place. One where people could live peacefully and not in fear of cursed spirits, as well as Jujutsu sorcerers not needlessly sacrificing themselves in order to defeat cursed spirits. Yuki would simply tell Yuji she would think about it, and that at the moment she wasn't really trying to join anybody. However, if Yuji did promise to do exactly what he says and creates a world where everyone could live in peace, she would gladly join him. Yuji would smile, as Tengen would dismiss Yuki, telling her that everything was going to be alright now. As Tengen would look Yuji in the eye and ask him, when do they start? Kenjaku, on the other hand, was getting insanely impatient. Almost a day has passed and Yuji wasn't back yet. He knew he couldn't trust Yuji. However, he needed those fingers of Sukuna. That was the only thing tying him to Yuji at all. If Yuji didn't have those fingers, he would have been left Yuji behind or attempted to kill him. Kenjaku wasn't stupid. He knew Yuji was planning something. He just couldn't figure out what. Yuji was incredibly smart for his age. And for a Jujutsu sorcerer, someone like Yuji was incredibly terrifying. He's kind of happy in a way that Sukuna wasn't able to reincarnate inside of Yuji. Otherwise, who knows what Sukuna would be able to do. Yuji's ability in his own hand was terrifying enough. He couldn't imagine if it was in the hands of someone like Sukuna. However, just then, Kenjaku would then hear a voice from behind him. It would be Yuji telling him to not space off so much and that someone could kill him if he's spacing out like that. Kenjaku would laugh, saying that Yuji wouldn't kill him yet, as Yuji would simply let off a smile. Yuji would then tell Kenjaku that now is the time. He's fully absorbed Tengen, turning them into a cursed object, and that they fused into one. Yuji now just needs the cursed energy from the culling games to completely be able to evolve, and once he does that, the perfect world will come into fruition. Yuji had already heard Kenjaku's plan on how to create the culling games, and how exactly he was going to do it. However, Yuji needed to believe that Kenjaku was in control. In doing so, Kenjaku would completely start the culling games in front of Yuji as they had both agreed to do so. Kenjaku would laugh and ask Yuji if he plans on joining the culling games themselves. Yuji would tell Kenjaku that more than likely he's going to, due to the fact that he wants to hurry the process of gaining cursed energy up, and he knows making rules and gaining points will only further that progress. It was a win-win for Yuji, as Kenjaku would have made it so that Yuji was a game master as well as Kenjaku, and that until either Kenjaku, Yuji, and Sukuna all died, the culling games was to continue no matter what. Kenjaku and Yuji would then both enter the barrier, as Kenjaku would set up his own base of operations, as at the same time Kenjaku would then begin to laugh. In his head, he would begin to call Yuji an idiot, falling directly into his trap. The fact that Yuji has consumed Tengen makes him technically half curse, along with that other blood painting. He knows the blood painting will follow quickly after Yuji, so in the beginning, he'll get the blood painting alone and completely absorb him, turning him into his own curse spirit. And then after that, since Yuji had consumed Tengen, he was technically half a curse, being more cursed than human. And since he absorbed Tengen, curse manipulation should work on Yuji as well. He would laugh, saying Yuji didn't realize it, but he was already inside of his barriers. Things weren't going to go well for him, as Kenjaku would simply laugh, telling himself that he's truly outdone himself. He would regroup with Sukuna, where Sukuna would be at 11 fingers. He would then tell Sukuna that some of the sorcerers had survived, and if that he wanted to go make a ruckus, he could start with killing them. And he could take Urame with him if he needed to. His entire job was simply to create as much cursed energy as he could, and when they got to a point where Yuji was exhausted, they would take him on, leaving him at death's door, and capturing him with curse manipulation. His plan was simple, yet it was the best possible plan that he could come up with at the moment. They were going to let Yuji fight as much as he could, exhaust him, wait for the time to strike, and then make everything theirs. And the Heian era would truly come back. However, Yuji was already 10 steps ahead of them. He knew Kenjaku probably planned on killing him, because he knew they were going to kill each other eventually. It was just a matter of who was going to outplay the other first. And Kenjaku didn't know it, but Yuji was leagues ahead of him. His first objective would be to take the prison realm, finding out where Kenjaku had held it, and giving it to the sorcerers. But in order to do that, he would have to get past Sukuna, which he didn't think was a big deal. The only thing was, his technique doesn't work when Sukuna uses his domain, due to the fact that Sukuna could simply send slashes everywhere he goes. Even if Yuji were to make illusions, it didn't matter how real they were or how real they weren't. Sukuna would simply slash through them, getting to Yuji eventually. He would have to figure out how to take down Sukuna first, and then move on to Kenjaku. Yuji had figured out everything in Jujutsu sorcery besides the domain expansion. Finding the true essence of his own technique, it was something he couldn't fully grasp yet. However, he was still just beginning his Jujutsu journey. He is where most people wish they could be as a Jujutsu sorcerer, and it's only his first year of being a Jujutsu sorcerer. So for right now, he was simply going to play along with Kenjaku. He would gather as many points as he can in order to make it so he can cross the barriers, going in and out of them freely. He was going to take on as many people, gather as many points as he could, and when the time was right, Sukuna and Kenjaku would die. So for right now, he would simply go around, killing sorcerers, gathering as many points as he can. Everything he was doing was for the greater good. all of these people's sacrifice will be for the greater good, as Yuji will keep fighting until eventually he would gain over 100 points, making the rules to where players will be able to cross colonies, as another rule would erupt at the same time, making it so players can share their points along with one another. Yuji will be intrigued by this rule, wondering who would add something like this. As he would make his way to Tokyo Colony number 1, Yuji would walk around as he would realize there weren't a lot of people left in this colony. All that were left were people who were simply hiding or trying to take out people who had just entered. 2 people had tried to take him out when he had first walked in here. However, he killed them almost instantly. Just then, he could feel a large wave of cursed energy coming from a theater. He would walk towards it. As he would walk inside, he would see a man sitting in a bathtub. He would ask the man if he was willing to die for his cause. As Higuruma would turn towards Yuji and ask him, is he the one that's been killing other people? He would tell Yuji that a player added a rule a while ago that allowed people to see other players' names and points, and Yuji's name popped up not too long ago. However, at the same time, he's been gathering points rapidly, faster than anyone he's ever seen, so that would technically mean Yuji has been going back and forth killing people non-stop. Yuji was simply a murderer in his eyes, and justice needed to be served. Yuji would then laugh, telling Higuruma that people like him who seek justice on other people are people who are simply trying to escape something from themselves. Justice is not some one-sided thing. Those who usually try to give out justice are ones who've done something, trying to gain redemption. Are you one of those people? Yuji would ask. Higuruma would simply sit silent for a moment. He would tell Yuji to stop trying to distract him with his words, and that it doesn't matter. Judgment still needs to be passed, especially for someone like him. He would summon his gavel in his hand, as he would summon his domain expansion, as Yuji would laugh, saying that this was interesting. An instant domain. This is when Judgment would put Yuji on trial. Higuruma would begin to explain the rules of his domain, as Judgment would put Yuji on the trial for killing people inside of the culling games. Yuji had killed at least well over 20 people due to the fact that he's gotten 100 points and has still been gathering points at this moment. Yuji would simply laugh and say that yeah, he did that. He's not gonna deny it or try to fight it, as Judgment would then scream out guilty, confiscation, plus death penalty. As Higuruma would gain the Executioner Sword, Yuji would study the blade up and down, realizing since Judgment has told him death penalty, that sword is probably meant to kill him, so he would avoid getting attacked by it for now at least. As Higuruma would immediately rush in, slashing towards Yuji, going for a thrust. However, Yuji would simply erupt a barrier around Higuruma, causing him to be crushed. As Higuruma would be confused, he would say that he thought he took away Yuji's curse technique, as Yuji would say that he did take away his curse technique. However, he wasn't using a curse technique at the moment, as this would leave Higuruma confused. He couldn't understand. How the hell was someone like him able to use something like this? It felt like a curse technique, however it wasn't a curse technique. Yuji would then begin to explain to Higuruma that he was simply using barrier techniques that had his cursed energy infused inside of it. He could even create bigger ones the size of Shibuya itself if he really wanted to. However, he's never had the motive to do so. He would then tell Higuruma that he doesn't actually want to kill him because he seems like someone that would be able to help him with his plans later on. Higuruma has a strong sense of justice, and Yuji sees something in him. Yuji would then begin to tell Higuruma that yes, he has indeed killed a bunch of people. However, it was all for the greater good. Yuji believes that people like Kenjaku and his plans shouldn't come to fruition. He would tell Higuruma that Kenjaku's original plan was to gather cursed energy in order to merge humanity with Tengen. However, Yuji has taken Tengen and merged it with himself, but it wasn't done forcefully like Kenjaku would have done. Instead of doing what Kenjaku was going to originally do, Yuji was going to use the cursed energy Kenjaku gathered inside of the culling games to merge that with himself, forcefully evolving himself with Tengen inside of him, transforming himself into an even greater version of himself, the perfect version of himself. Higuruma would then tell Yuji that he shouldn't have to kill people for his plan to come true. However, Yuji would rebuttal this, saying that these people are fighting tooth and nail. Some of these people shouldn't even be alive right now. They were revived from thousands of years ago, trying to get another chance to live. However, their time has been up. Half of them were modern sorcerers, and half of them were sorcerers of the past, but Yuji doesn't believe any of them should be the way they are currently. The sorcerers of the past should still be dead, and the modern day sorcerers shouldn't have awakened at all. Most of the modern day sorcerers immediately turned evil, attempting to kill others with their newfound powers. You are no different, Higuruma. Yuji would then disrupt his barrier, as Higuruma would desummon his executioner sword. Yuji would continue talking, telling Higuruma that once everything was said and done, he was going to create a world where people like Higuruma thrived. People with a sense of justice will be able to thrive in his new world, because Yuji doesn't want anybody else to die unnecessarily. Anyone that steps out of line, Higuruma could be the first person to deal with them if he wanted to, as long as he joined Yuji's new world, and after his perfection, Higuruma would tell Yuji that he would simply think about it, and that he still feels the guilt of the 2 people that he's already killed. He would then ask Yuji, does he not feel guilty for killing those that had nothing to do with the plan that he has? Yuji would put his head down, telling Higuruma that it's not that he doesn't feel guilty. He believes these deaths to be actually for the greater good. These people were forced to do something that Kenjaku wanted them to do. They had no choice in the matter. Yuji acted out of genuine concern. He wants the world to be a better place, and in doing so, he needs to gather the cursed energy that's possible, and the only reason for him to do that is to kill more Jujutsu sorcerers. However, he will take those with an actual sense of justice, or people who have somewhat of the same mindset as him, and make it so that when the new world is to happen and he kills Kenjaku and Sukuna, no one will ever question the authority of those in power. It will be a peaceful world where people can live in peace. No one has to needlessly sacrifice themselves, and the sense of justice will be truly upheld. Higuruma would simply close his eyes as he would breathe out. He would tell Yuji that he simply needs to give him time to think about it, and that if Yuji does actually intend on making a world where his justice is actually upheld, he will gladly join him. But for right now, as long as the culling games are active, he will continue doing whatever he wants, enacting his own personal sense of justice until it stopped completely. Yuji would laugh and tell Higuruma that he looks forward to working with him in the future, and telling him that his next objective is to gain another 100 points to reinforce the rules once more. He would tell Higuruma that Kenjaku believes that he's the headmaster of everything, but Yuji had already erupted the barriers of the culling games a while ago. Before he left to go grab Tengen, Yuji had erupted the barriers to the culling games and maxed them under his illusions. Kenjaku never realized because his head was so far up his own ass. Yuji is simply using Kenjaku to get what he wants, allowing him to believe he has control. But once Yuji has gathered enough cursed energy, he would transfer the energy inside of himself, forcing his evolution and killing Kenjaku. The plan was simple. Higuruma would simply wave Yuji away as he would tell him that he looks forward to Yuji working with him. Yuji had just fought Higuruma, and he had made it so that Higuruma would join him later down the line. He was planting seeds for other people who shared the same ideals as him, so they could join him later in the new world. So for right now, the only thing that he needed to do was to attempt to gather as many allies as he could, ones that shared the same ideals as him. And if they didn't, they would simply be nothing more than a sacrifice for the new world. Yuji's next stop would be the Sandai colony. He would notice there were numerous sorcerers here who were pretty strong, and maybe some of them shared the same ideals as him. However, at the same time, he would notice there was a Jujutsu sorcerer here, and he didn't want to get tangled with them. He knew that they probably knew more than he thought they knew, seeing as Kenjaku told Yuji earlier that there was a mole in the Jujutsu high school, and that they were given information on how to get inside. Yuji knew that more than likely the mole was playing both sides, so he would stay on his toes and try to avoid the Jujutsu sorcerer, seeing as he didn't want to deal with that mess. However, just as Yuji would be scanning the area, trying to figure out where everybody was, he would suddenly be attacked by 2 different Shikigami. One would fly right towards him, attempting to strike him. However, Yuji would then begin exerting his cursed energy, making the Shikigami drop to the ground. Just then, Yuji would feel rumbling from underneath his feet, as a Shikigami would erupt from the ground, attempting to swallow Yuji whole. However, Yuji would simply start exerting his cursed energy even stronger, making the Shikigami crash right back down into the ground. Yuji would laugh and say that this was somewhat of an interesting technique. He only knows one other person who uses Shikigami, however they aren't as efficient as this guy was. Yuji would then turn, as he would notice a large amount of cursed energy gathering in one area, as all of a sudden, the Shikigami that were amassing around him would suddenly disappear.
Yuji would crack a smile, saying that things were about to get interesting. Yuji would notice that a Jujutsu sorcerer had taken out the sorcerer that was attacking him. Yuji would then use a veil, covering himself up, and going to a tall building to try to realize what was going on. He would watch as Yuta was protecting civilians, trying to get them away as he was fighting a cockroach curse. Yuji would say that Yuta has a great heart. However, due to him being a Jujutsu sorcerer, he doubts that he'll share the same ideals as him. He was only going to sit back for now and watch what Yuta could do. Yuta would take care of the cockroach curse, finishing it off by pushing reverse curse technique inside of its body. Yuji would note that Yuta has a decent battle IQ. However, he would then see someone that would pique his interest. They would appear next to Yuta, blasting him across the area. As Yuta and Uro will begin their fight, Yuji would be close by listening to what each other has to say, seeing if he could play to their heartstrings. In the end, Uro would catch his interest once more. Someone who was betrayed and used by the Jujutsu Society. Someone who understands you shouldn't have to sacrifice yourself for others. That's not what it means to be a Jujutsu sorcerer, especially not in Yuji's eyes. This is when Uro would grab Yuta by the neck, pushing him outside of the building. This is when, at the same time, Ryu would then begin charging a granite blast from across the colony. He would tell them to not forget him, shooting the beam out. However, instead of it hitting both Uro and Yuta, Yuji would step in, contracting a barrier, stopping the attack head on. However, at the same time, Yuji would notice the output on that attack was incredibly strong. Even though Yuji has a strong output himself, he had never encountered someone like that. Last second, Yuji had to put even more cursed energy into the barrier, due to it almost shattering off impact. Yuta would notice Yuji immediately. Hearing the news from Mekamaru, Yuta would ask what the hell he was doing here, as Yuji would only smile, saying that it was nice to see one of his fellow classmates, as Yuta would get pissed off, telling Yuji that he wasn't his classmate. Yuji would then appear behind Uro, as he would put his hand on her shoulder, and he would tell her that he would like her to join his cause. Everyone would be shocked by this, seeing as no one saw Yuji move at all. However, if he was that fast enough to get behind Uro without anybody noticing, he must have been insanely fast. Uro would then attempt to turn around and use Thin Icebreaker. However, Yuji would simply grab her arm and telling her that there's no need for them to fight. He only wants to offer her a proposition. He would begin telling her that he was the one who started the culling games, not Kenjaku. Kenjaku was the one who used Auto Transfiguration, allowing you to reincarnate in this world. The rules are exactly the same as Kenjaku wants them to be. However, Yuji can stop the games whenever he wants to, and he plans on doing it the second he has enough cursed energy. He won't tell her his full plans, however, he wants her to join him in the world that comes after. Yuta would scream out, asking Yuji, does he truly believe he can create a new world solely by himself? This is when Yuji would turn at Yuta and tell him that no, he can't. That's exactly why he's gathering people who share the same ideals as him. Uro would refuse at first, attempting to use Thin Icebreaker on Yuji again. However, Yuji would then erupt the barrier around her, forcing her down to the ground. Yuta would then begin thinking Yuji's technique had to be some type of barrier technique. Due to the fact that he was only utilizing that, Yuta just had to not get caught by it. Yuji would then touch the ground, as he would dismiss his barrier that was around Uro. He would tell her once more that he refuses to fight her. However, Uro would scream out, telling Yuji that she refuses to be a servant to anybody. She fell for that in her last life, and she refuses to do it again. However, Yuji would tell her that he will not have her live underneath him. They will live as equals. She will not be a tool that has to be used. She is free to do whatever she wants. However, in Yuji's new world, everyone will be equal, and everyone will live amongst each other. No one is over anybody. Yuji would also note to Uro that even though she's been betrayed by people, she still has her pride, and she refuses to be what other people believe she is. And that's exactly why he wants her to be a part of his new world. He's already recruited others, and he wants her to be a part of that. Yuta would attempt to rush in, trying to stop his conversation with Uro. As he would slash at Yuji, Yuji would just narrowly dodge out of the way, noticing that Yuta was fast. Yuta would then turn his blade around, dashing in at Yuji once more. He would throw a punch with his right, straight at Yuji's face. Yuji, however, would catch the punch, as Yuta would attempt to overpower him using pure cursed energy. However, Yuji would begin to laugh, telling Yuta that he's too naive, as he would begin to exert his cursed energy, crushing Yuta under the pressure. Yuta would begin struggling, as Yuji would tell Yuta that he doesn't want to get involved with any type of Jujutsu sorcerer, so he recommends that he just leaves him alone. He's only here to gather allies, and he doubts Yuta wants to join him. Uro would then tell Yuji that she doesn't want to live for anybody. She simply wants to live for herself. Yuji would then turn towards Uro and tell her that she is very welcome to live for herself. Yuji does not want to enforce any kind of rules on anybody. The only thing he wants to enforce is that people live equally. Not a single Jujutsu sorcerer, civilian, or cursed spirit will live indifferent from one another. If one person decides to step out of line, Yuji himself will deal with it. And if anyone tries to disrupt his plans, he will kill them, as he will begin to stare at Yuta. Uro having been betrayed before, she would tell Yuji that she refuses to believe him. However, she will keep it in mind. Yuji would then tell Uro that if she doesn't believe him, he will have to simply prove it to her. He would ask Uro, is there anything that she wants? However, Uro would simply tell Yuji that she simply wants her second chance at life, and for it not to be the same as her first one. She wants to live for herself and do things for herself, as Yuji would tell her that he understands. Yuji would then look over to Yuta and ask him, what will you do, Jujutsu Sorcerer? Yuta would look at Yuji and Uro, realizing that they've come to a truce. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do. He knew Yuji was incredibly strong, due to the fact that Mechamaru told the Jujutsu Sorcerers that were left alive that Yuji was the one that sealed Satoru Gojo. He knew that out of all of the students, he was the only one that could take on Yuji. However, there were much more things at risk instead of just Yuji. Sukuna was still a factor, Kenjaku was still a factor, Yuji was just one of the factors. There was too much going on, and not enough sorcerers to be able to handle it. Ria would then attempt to jump in, throwing in another granite blast, screaming out, saying that we're getting too mushy around here. Where is everyone's pride as a Jujutsu sorcerer? As Yuji would step in front of the beam, being hit by it head on. However, as the smoke would settle, Yuji would tell Ryu that he simply doesn't like him. His indifference towards lives makes him a disgusting person. Yuji has not killed a single civilian during his entire time here. He doesn't believe any of them deserve to die. They are ones who've been trapped here. The only people Yuji has killed has been sorcerers that has attacked him. Yuji was never the one to start the fight. However, Ryu simply didn't care. If innocents were to get in his way, he wouldn't care. He would kill them needlessly. Ryu would then tell Yuji that he doesn't like all this talking and he simply wants a good fight. Throughout his entire past life, he was never able to find a dessert that was worthwhile for him. He wants something that's going to cure his insatiable boredom. He has no philosophical or villainous intent. He simply wants to enjoy the thrill of battle. Yuji would then look at Ryu and ask him, is that so? As the air around all of them would change, Ryu would immediately get on guard. As Yuji would begin to smile, Yuji would tell Ryu that he was going to cure his boredom right here and right now. He would then turn around to Yuta and tell him that he'd better not jump in, otherwise he was going to kill him too. Ryu would begin to sweat nervously, realizing exactly what he was getting himself into. Ryu would charge up a granite blast immediately, shooting it at Yuji, as Yuji would place the barrier around himself once more, stopping the blast in its tracks, as Ryu would realize this matchup was not in his favor. He would smile and laugh, calling Yuji a coward, asking him was he simply going to hide behind a barrier the entire fight, as Yuji would smile and tell Ryu that his childish remarks would get him nowhere. As Yuji would appear behind Ryu, striking him in the back, sending him flying into a building. Ryu would gather himself, shooting another granite blast at Yuji, as Yuji would simply sprint forward, dodging every blast. Ryu would then realize that he might need to put more distance between himself and Yuji, as even though Yuji was pretty skinny, he had insane physical prowess. He would begin jumping away, shooting granite blast at Yuji back to back, as Yuji would simply dodge out of the way, jumping from building to building, attempting to close the distance on Ryu again. As Ryu would find himself sprinting inside of a subway tunnel, as he would place himself right in front of Yuji. Yuji would stand outside the subway tunnel laughing, asking Ryu was this his big plan, putting him into a confined space so he could have a better chance at attacking him. Ryu would then smile, saying that Jujutsu sorcerers are supposed to think smart and that's how they're going to win. Yuji would begin laughing, telling Ryu that he can't deny that. As he would begin to rush forward, Ryu would begin shooting blasts back to back. Yuji would simply dodge over and over as Ryu would begin to get concerned, as he would then charge a full power granite blast, filling up the entirety of the subway. As he would begin to smile, asking Yuji how did he feel about that. As Yuji would be behind Ryu, telling him that it wasn't really that impressive. Ryu would attempt to strike Yuji in the face, however, Yuji was already 2 steps ahead of him, hitting him in the side of the stomach and hitting him in the face. Ryu would attempt to distance himself once more, however, Yuji would pull him closer, landing a devastating combo on him. He would punch him in the face with the left. As Ryu would attempt to strike back, however, it would be easily parried by Yuji. As Yuji would throw an elbow at Ryu's stomach, making him cough up blood. Yuji would then continue punching Ryu over and over. Ryu's technique was burnt out, and Yuji wasn't giving him a chance to regather himself. Yuji would then smile, asking Ryu was it really that smart of him to do that, as Ryu would only smile. However, Yuji would continue his combo, striking at Ryu over and over, until Ryu would yell out, screaming that he's had enough.
He would kick himself off of Yuji, screaming at the top of his lungs. He would tell Yuji that a great meal is best enjoyed when both parties are enjoying it. He would proceed to make hand signs as he would scream out the words domain expansion. Yuji would then laugh as he would make hand signs as well. Yuji would then say the words domain expansion, mirror of 1,000 dreams. The domains would only clash for a moment. However, Yuji's domain would take over Ryu's in an instant. However, to Ryu, it seemed as if his own domain had won. Ryu's domain would be an area that's a starry night sky. As Ryu would point up into the air, beams from the sky would proceed to shoot out like fireworks going off in the distance as they would blast themselves straight towards Yuji. It would strike him straight in the chest, causing him to be blasted backwards to the domain's wall. As Ryu would keep pointing, each beam would continuously strike Yuji over and over until eventually, Yuji was a charred crisp on the ground. As Ryu would begin to laugh, telling Yuji that he really did satisfy him and that he's grateful Yuji was able to show him such a great battle. The domain would seemingly collapse. However, Ryu would be sitting there smiling as he would look towards Yuta and Uro. He would ask both of them, who's the next person to satisfy him? Ryu would feel in an absolute state of euphoria. However, unknown to Ryu, Yuji's domain had taken complete effect of him. Ryu's domain causes so whatever the other person caught inside his domain wills is exactly what will happen. However, only for them. They will be stuck in a trance-like state, believing whatever they believe, stuck inside of their own mind, until Yuji himself breaks them out of it. So while Yuji would collapse his domain, Yuta and Uro would see Ryu sitting there, staring up at the sky, talking to himself. Yuji would then turn around, as he would sit and ask the other two if they were ready to continue their conversation. Both Uro and Yuta would realize that Yuji was a lot stronger than he seemed to let on. He never really showed a true technique, and the one time he did, they weren't able to see it due to the fact that it was enclosed in his own domain. Yuji would tell Yuta that he refuses to let other Jujutsu sorcerers get involved in what he's doing, and that he doesn't actually wish to harm them. However, if they get in his way, he will be forced to. Yuta would then ask him what exactly is his goal, where Yuji would tell Yuta that all he wishes to do is create the perfect world and become the perfect being. He would tell Yuta that Tengen had willingly merged herself with him, and due to that fact, he only needed the cursed energy from the culling games. He would tell Yuta that once every single barrier is filled to the brim with cursed energy, he would merge that energy with himself, causing an evolution that would turn him into the perfect being, something like Tengen. But the evolution will not need sacrifices like Tengen. Tengen is the sacrifice, and so is Yuji. They will merge, and Yuji will simply evolve. Yuta would then ask Yuji, what is he going to do next then? As Yuji would say, his only goal for right now is to gather as much cursed energy as he can. He knows that Kenjaku plans on letting non-sorcerers inside the barrier, and when that happens, the cursed energy that's already inside of the barrier will almost double or triple, filling it up faster. Yuji already knows this because again, he's created the barriers, not Kenjaku. He already knows that Tokyo Colony No. 1's barrier has been filled up to the brim. The other colonies are the only ones left that need to be filled. When Yuji is done here, he's going to go to the other colonies and try to fill the cursed energy there before any non-sorcerers get hurt. Yuta would then tell Yuji that he doesn't need to do all of this, and he could have asked the Jujutsu sorcerers to give him help. Yuji would then stop Yuta and tell him that even though Gojo Satoru wasn't fond of the higher-ups, he knows for a fact Gojo wouldn't support him in the plan that he has right now. Killing sorcerers and other people who disrupt the balance, Gojo would not have done that. Yuji knows that Gojo understands the weight behind certain decisions. However, the weight behind this decision is something Yuji is going to take on by himself. That's why he's been moving himself away from the Jujutsu sorcerers. That's why he took the necessary evil to seal Satoru Gojo. He was going to take all the heat from the higher-ups currently, making the Jujutsu sorcerers put all their eyes on him. And in doing so, he already knows a player inside of the barriers named Hana or Angel. They are going to be the one that will unseal Gojo Satoru. Yuji's already thought everything out. He's been 10 steps ahead of everybody. He just couldn't let anybody know. However, once again, Yuji is not on the side of the Jujutsu sorcerers, nor is he on Kenjaku's side. He is on his own side. He is willing to take the heat of everything and do everything for himself to create this new world for his grandfather. This is something he's sworn to himself ever since his grandfather died. His grandfather told him to become the perfect version of himself, so that's exactly what he's going to do. And once again, if the Jujutsu sorcerers or anybody will try to stand up to him, he will kill them. Once he gathers all the cursed energy that he can throughout the barriers, before he takes it all in, he's going to kill Sukuna and kill Kenjaku. And if he isn't strong enough to do so, he will simply absorb all the cursed energy, evolve, and then kill him. Yuji is well aware that Sukuna is a force of nature by himself. However, with Kenjaku and that other sorcerer with him, Yuji knows it'll be a challenge. The last time Yuji fought Sukuna was only at 6 fingers. Now Sukuna was well over 13 fingers. Sukuna was already strong in his own right the first time he fought him. However, it's going to be a different story now, and Sukuna knows a little bit about Yuji's technique. Yuta would then tell Yuji that even if he believes the Jujutsu sorcerers are not on his side, they are willing to help him, especially in defeating Kenjaku and Sukuna. He doesn't know about the rest of Yuji's plans. However, if Yuta has to become a monster, he will. Yuta is willing to do a lot more than Yuji thinks he is. Yuji would thank Yuta, however, he would tell him that he needs to focus on his own people for right now. Yuji is gathering his own force as he would look towards Uro. By the end of this, Yuji is going to have his own team that would help him in his evolution. Right now, one of his brothers was out there helping him gather cursed energy. He's half cursed spirit and has blood manipulation. Yuji would tell Yuta if he ever sees him out and about, do not fight him because they are on the same side. That goes along with someone named Higuruma. Right now, Yuji was going to go to another colony as he would ask Uro once more, does she plan on joining him later down the line? Everything that Yuji said before still stands. Uro would simply tell Yuji that she will think about it. She's still not quick to trust due to her past life. However, Yuji seems promising, so she will simply wait it out, see exactly what he can do, and then make her choice then. Yuji would nod his head as he would tell Yuta once more, do not stand in my way, otherwise I will be forced to kill you. As Yuta would simply let off a nervous smile as he would turn towards Uro, asking her for her points. Uro would scoff as Yuji would walk off. His next objective was going to be Tokyo Colony number 2. He heard that there was a strong fighter there, and hopefully they shared the same ideals as him. Yuji would get there, however, he would be surprised by what he saw. There was a huge crater in the middle of Tokyo Colony number 2, as he would see Sukuna there laughing, with someone split in two right in front of him. Yuji would think to himself, should he take Sukuna out now? It would be the better option. However, there were still things he needed to do, and filling the cursed energy in this colony, it was nearly full. However, Yuji would be surprised once more, as another player would sneak attack him from the back, as a liquid metal construct would try to strike Yuji directly in the chest. He would just narrowly dodge out of the way, as it would nick him on the arm. Sukuna would notice this, as he would look over and see Yuji, as well as see Yorozu. Yuji would kiss his teeth, realizing that he's been caught. He doesn't know how he didn't notice that there was another player right behind him this entire time. As Yorozu would scream out that she doesn't want any more people getting in her way. She has been trying to fight Sukuna for the longest. She's been trying to show Sukuna her love. She was waiting for that one lightning guy to die already. And next up was her turn. However, Yuji walked in here, and she doesn't want anyone getting in their way. She would scream out, sending the liquid construct towards Yuji once more, as Yuji would put up a barrier around himself, and fusing it with his cursed energy, causing the construct to fall directly to the ground, as Yorozu would let it dissipate, spawning it again right next to her, as she would jump onto the air, creating insect-like wings from the constructs, flying straight towards Yuji. As Sukuna would also sprint towards Yuji, he would scream out to Yuji, telling him that he's waited for him to come back. He's going to kill him, rip him apart. The embarrassment that he had last time was nothing more than a fluke. Sukuna has more fingers now, and he will show the brat exactly where he lies in Jujutsu sorcery. Sukuna would point his hand straight towards Yuji, as he would send out dismantles straight towards Yuji. Yuji would try to do the same thing he did before to Sukuna, wrapping himself with a barrier that was infused with his curse technique. However, surprising Yuji, the attack was a lot stronger than it was last time. It would go straight through the barrier, as it would connect with Yuji's arm. It wouldn't cut straight through it, however, it would leave a large gash on Yuji's arm. Yuji would use reverse curse technique healing it up, however, he would realize that he was in trouble. He didn't know if he'd be fighting both of them at the same time, or each of them individually. Yuji would simply smile, as just as he thought he'd only be fighting the two, a wave of ice would wash over the battlefield as it would attempt to strike Yuji. Yuji would jump up into the air, as he would realize this wasn't going to end well for him at all. Yuji may have been strong, however, he was never sure if he could face Sukuna at a high amount of fingers. He would simply have to rely on his wit and battle knowledge. Yorozu would send her liquid construct towards Yuji once more, as Yuji would be forced on the defensive. Sukuna, not giving a care in the world, would continue sending dismantles at Yuji, as he would have to continuously throw up barriers, stacking them repetitively, in order to try to combat Sukuna. Things weren't going the way he wanted them to go. If anything, Yuji would try to use his technique to escape, because he knew right now, with both Yorozu and Sukuna on top of him, things were going to take a turn for the worse. The ice sorcerer wasn't that big of a deal, however, with the constant pressure from both Sukuna and Yorozu, the other sorcerer would be a pain in the ass to deal with, so Yuji would simply have to grit his teeth for now. He would simply dodge Yorozu's constructs, while erupting barriers in order to deflect Sukuna's dismantles. Yuji would then say the word shatter, as his technique would then activate, making clones of everybody, as they would be scattered across the battlefield. However, Sukuna would begin laughing. He would tell Yuji that if he thinks a petty trick like this will work against him, he has another thing in mind. If Yuji wants to play it like this, Sukuna will simply erupt his domain and kill everybody and everything in the vicinity. While Sukuna was saying all this, Yuji was simply trying to take some time to gather himself, trying to figure out what his next action was going to be. He would think to himself, should he simply just retreat? Or should he fight? Taking them out here would honestly be a good thing. However, he doesn't know if he'll be able to take all three of them on at the same time. If anything, he might as well let Yorozu and Sukuna duke it out by themselves, and then Yuji will clean up in the aftermath. Or he will simply let Sukuna be, gathering his strength. Honestly, it was looking like the latter. Yuji might need to retreat for now and come back later. Sukuna was a lot stronger than he thought he was going to be, and fighting a Sukuna at 20 fingers, or almost 20 fingers, was going to be a death sentence for Yuji. As long as he was able to evolve, he would be able to kill Sukuna. It doesn't matter how strong Sukuna is. Yuji will simply play it smart. He wasn't going to take his chances here. However, Sukuna wasn't having any of it. He would immediately say the words domain expansion, popping his domain for a second time. As everything within a 200-meter radius would begin to be torn to shreds, every single illusion that Yuji had created would be completely eviscerated, turning the area into a wasteland, as both Yorozu and Arame would begin to use Hollow Wicker Basket. As just then, Sukuna would finally collapse his domain. He would laugh as he would see Yuji on the floor, with most of his limbs torn off, bleeding out. He would walk over to Yuji as he would step on his head and begin to crush it. He would tell him that he knows this isn't him. However, he knows he's listening. He would tell him this: the next time we come across one another, I will kill you slowly and watch you suffer. This new world that you want to create will not come to happen. I will be the one to create a new world, ruled by only me, while you will watch as I tear everything that you've grown already apart. Just you wait, brat. As he would fully crush the head of the illusion, watching it shatter. Yuji would still be in the area. However, he would have a veil over himself, hiding away from everyone, as he would simply let off an evil smile, thinking to himself that he fully accepts the challenge. He can't wait to put the King of Curses in his place. He can't wait to crush Sukuna under his own strength, and watch someone who views strength as absolute be crushed by that same ideal. This was nothing but a challenge that Yuji was going to accept. The only reason Sukuna was able to even do anything right now was simply because Yuji was caught off guard by the other people there. If Sukuna was alone, Yuji would have easily taken on Sukuna and killed him right then and there. Yuji would simply laugh as he would make his way towards another colony. After his encounter with Sukuna, Yuji didn't know what he wanted to do. If it was just Sukuna by himself, he could have taken him on. However, with those other two there, he was simply going to bide his time. For now, his entire objective was simply to focus on filling the barriers with cursed energy, as much as he could. In fact, he had already noticed in one of the other colonies, there was a huge amount of cursed energy being generated at a rapid pace. He could only wonder what was happening over there. His plan for right now was to simply try to gather as much cursed energy as he can throughout the barriers. So if he could feed his cursed energy into the barrier as well, things would progress a lot smoother from here on out. He would go straight towards the Sakurajima colony, where he would see 3 people already fighting it out. There was one girl without any cursed energy at all, an extremely fast cursed spirit, and some guy that knew how to use blood manipulation. He would think it was Choso at first, but he would quickly dismiss that, seeing the man, just coming to an understanding that they may be related somehow. He would notice with them fighting, they were generating a lot of cursed energy, more of the cursed spirit generating it. He had never seen anything like this. The cursed spirit was extremely fast, but it was extremely grotesque, a worm-like looking creature. It had pinned Maki to a wall and was telling her about how much he hated her, telling her that he came back from the dead just to kill her. Noritoshi would attempt to fire off a piercing blood attack, attempting to kill the cursed spirit in one fell swoop. The attack would land, however, it would force the cursed spirit to turn itself into a cursed room, attempting to evolve. Yuji would simply sit back and watch and let them gather as much cursed energy. His job wasn't to get in the way here, it was simply to watch and let the cursed energy gather. The only reason he came over here is because he was interested in what was making so much cursed energy in the first place. Although he knows that Maki is a part of the Jujutsu sorcerers, if anything were to happen to her, he would simply step in and stop it. Noritoshi, not wanting the cursed spirit to evolve any further, would attempt to use convergence once more, slapping it together to use another piercing blood. He would shoot off the piercing blood as it would pierce directly through the cursed room. Noritoshi would believe that that was the end of that and would be thankful that the curse didn't evolve any further, because if it did, it would have been even faster. However, before Maki or Noritoshi could even think, the cursed spirit had already evolved and was already next to Noritoshi, punching him, sending him flying with a lightning fast punch, sending him crashing through multiple tree lines. The curse would exclaim that Noritoshi was trash and was completely clueless about his place. Yuji would find this interesting. A jujutsu sorcerer that came back to life as a cursed spirit simply to get revenge on someone he hated. He had heard about Maki destroying the Zenin clan, but he didn't realize the Zenin clan hated her this much, to the point where one of them would come back as a cursed spirit. It was fascinating, and on top of that, he could understand why people like the Zenin clan would hate people like Maki. The Zenin clan was one of the big three clans that had took confidence in their cursed energy and their cursed energy techniques. Of course they would hate someone like Maki, someone who had zero cursed energy at all. Zero cursed energy, zero cursed technique, yet she held the Zenin name. She had to be an embarrassment to them. However, it would seem that their entitled look on Maki would be why they had their downfall. This would make Yuji fascinated with Maki, someone with zero cursed energy. He's never even thought about someone like Maki. Even while he was at the school, he never once thought about Maki. She never once took his attention, but now, something was different about her. He would simply continue watching to see what she can do, as cursed spirit Naoya would continue to rush down both Maki and Noritoshi. The fight would go on as it does in the original, until eventually Maki's body would be smashed into the ground from a high-speed impact. She would have failed to stop one of Naoya's attacks and would be heavily injured. Naoya would stand triumphantly over Maki and taunt her, saying that he couldn't believe he ever lost to her. This is when Yuji would finally make his move. He would jump off the building that he was standing atop, landing right next to both Naoya and Maki. Both Maki and Naoya would look over as they would both see Yuji just standing there, as Yuji would wave his hand, telling Naoya that it was a pleasure to meet him, as well as meeting Maki as well. Naoya would continue crushing Maki. Naoya would continue crushing down on Maki as he would speak out to Yuji, asking him who the hell was he. Yuji would simply tell Naoya that he was simply here to help. However, Naoya would scoff and tell Yuji that he doesn't need his help at all. Yuji would then laugh, saying that he believes Naoya is mistaken. He's not here to help him. Naoya would then ask if that was so, as Yuji would just simply say that it sure is. He would pick up Maki and throw her to the side, rushing straight towards Yuji at blinding speeds. Yuji would simply smile, staring at Naoya speed at him, as Naoya would attempt to run Yuji over completely. However, Yuji would simply step out of the way. However, Yuji would then turn into a glass panel, as Naoya would laugh out, coming back around, picking up speed, as he would tell Yuji that he was an idiot for trying to save someone who didn't deserve to be saved. It's a shame that he wanted to save such a worthless person like her, so instead of coming to save her, he's simply going to die instead. Naoya would come back around, going as fast as he could, as he would rocket straight towards Yuji, slamming his head into Yuji, blowing a hole straight through his torso. He would begin to laugh once more, saying that he can't believe someone like him came so boldly, only to die so simply. He would then turn around, looking for Maki and asking where she was now. This is when Naoya would hear a voice behind him saying that they weren't quite done yet. Naoya would turn around, absolutely confused. He was sure he just hit Yuji. He was sure he just killed Yuji. What the hell just happened? Yuji would say that, yeah, he killed him, sure, but killing him simply won't be enough. He's going to have to do a lot better than that. And this would begin to piss Naoya off. He didn't know who this guy was or why he decided to jump in the middle of his fight, but he was going to make him pay. This nobody let Maki get away, and now he's going to suffer the consequences for that. He would rush at Yuji once more, picking up speed as he went, as Yuji would be doing nothing but analyzing what his technique was. He kinda got the basis of it when he watched Naoya turn one of his copies into a panel. Also, while watching Naoya pick up speed, he notices certain things, The cursed spirit takes certain actions, and when he matches those actions, he significantly boosts himself in speed, so Yuji would only think that the same applies to him. However, if Yuji didn't complete the action that was needed from him, he would freeze in frame like his copy did. However, what if he were to beat Naoya before he could complete the action? Would it bypass the rules of his own technique? Yuji wasn't sure at all. However, all he did know was that he loved experimenting, especially in the midst of battle. Everything to Yuji was an experiment. Naoya would continue rushing straight towards Yuji, as Yuji would have to try to figure out exactly when Naoya would complete his actions. He didn't know exactly how the technique worked, he only knew the basic. The only thing Naoya had over Yuji was speed. However, in everything else, Yuji completely surpassed him in. Naoya would continue rushing straight towards Yuji. As Yuji would try his first time to counter Naoya, he would reach out his hand, placing a barrier around himself. However, he would be turned into a frame once more, as Naoya would graze himself onto Yuji, spinning himself back around, picking up a lot more speed, as he would crash into Yuji once more. However, this time, Yuji would only be blasted back. He would only say the words, "interesting." As Naoya would continue to wrap around once more, he wanted to finish this fast so he could get back to Maki. So this next attack, he would pick up as much speed as he could and break right through Yuji. He doesn't know how Yuji got out of it the first time. All he knows is that this time, he was going to kill him. Yuji would then begin to speak out loud, telling Naoya that he believes it's funny how he views Maki. Not too long ago, Yuji had no viewpoint on Maki. However, just watching her now, it made him gain insight on certain aspects of cursed energy itself. On other people besides him, he couldn't believe there was someone like Maki to begin with. He heard of someone that was like Maki in the past, however, he didn't actually think it was true. He knew about heavenly restrictions, but Maki's was a completely special case. One that makes it so cursed energy itself does not dwell in the body, however, they still exist in the world. It's quite fascinating. It's a shame someone like Naoya looks down on someone like Maki for having no cursed energy. Yuji would then stare up just as Naoya would be right in front of him. Yuji would simply step to the side, turning his body, as Naoya would blast straight past him. This would confuse Naoya. He wasn't expecting Yuji to dodge, especially not him. Yuji would then laugh, saying that he could have ended the fight right there. He would then say that he understands why Maki was able to defeat him in the first place. It was hilarious that how the same person that he looked down on, the one person that he viewed as insignificant, was the one to kill him. And she probably would have done the same thing again had Yuji left them alone. This would begin to piss Naoya off beyond belief. Who was this nobody to talk to him, heir of the Zenin, like that? He couldn't believe his ears. He would begin to scream out that Maki only got lucky. That's the only reason she beat him. Yuji would then laugh and ask, was it really luck? Or are you really just that weak? Naoya would then scream out that he'll show Yuji weak, as Yuji would then have a large smile grow on his face. Naoya would begin to shoot himself directly towards Yuji, picking up speed at a rapid pace, even faster than he was before. As Yuji would then begin counting in his head, every single moment where Naoya would pick up speed and gain another burst, Yuji would be counting as he would lift his foot up into the air. And as Naoya would appear right in front of Yuji, he would drop his foot down as he would laugh, calling Naoya a complete idiot. As Yuji's foot would connect with Naoya's face, slamming him into the ground. Yuji would laugh, telling Naoya that he was so easy to rage bait. He gets mad too easily, and that's why he loses. He would laugh again, telling Naoya that this is exactly the reason he lost to Maki. He can see why Maki was able to defeat someone like him, because Naoya is simply too weak. Naoya would then scream out, calling Yuji a bastard, as his body would begin to transform, as a humanoid-like torso figure would pop out of the creature. He would scream at Yuji, telling him that if he thinks he's weak, then tell him what he thinks about this. He would make hand signs and begin to say the words, domain expansion, time cell moon palace. Yuji would immediately activate simple domain, casting numerous barriers upon himself, as Naoya would then scream out, calling Yuji a coward. He would tell Yuji that if he's so proud about his strength and Naoya is so weak, Why did he need to use simple domain? As Yuji would simply tell Naoya, rolling his eyes. Now why exactly would he simply take a hit from him just because? This is what Yuji means when he says Naoya is an idiot. This would piss off Naoya even more. However, before Naoya even got the chance to say anything more, he would feel a blade pierce his back, going straight through it. As Yuji would simply say, see what he means? As Maki would have stabbed Naoya with the split soul katana, killing Naoya immediately, collapsing the domain. As Yuji would then sigh, saying that was a big risk. He was kinda hoping that she came back and saved him, but there was also the chance that she would just leave. He would tell Maki that he was quivering in his boots. She would look at Yuji and tell him that she's not so stupid to believe that. She knows he could have killed him at any given point, so why did he waste so much time? Yuji would say that he was simply letting him use as much cursed energy as possible, and that he knew eventually Maki would come and finish the job. Maki would ask, who exactly is Yuji? As Yuji would simply say that he's someone that wants to make the world a better place. He would tell Maki that he's already met up with her other classmates. He would tell Maki where they were and say that he was going to be on his way now. The only reason he came here was so that he could gather more cursed energy. That was it, and that was all. He would then proceed to walk away, as Maki would be confused beyond belief. She had heard about Yuji before. However, she didn't know that he was capable of doing stuff like this. The last she heard of him, he died to a special great cursed spirit. And now, all of a sudden, he was back alive and he could have killed Naoya super easily. There was a lot of things she was going to have to catch up on. But for right now, she would simply go regroup with the other Jujutsu sorcerers. Yuji would know to himself that battle had gathered a lot of cursed energy, and there was only a small bit of cursed energy left that was needed to fill the barriers. Everything was going according to plan. This would cause Yuji to walk around, looking for more cursed users to help him fill the barrier. However, he would then hear a grating voice behind him, telling him that everything has been going according to his plan. Yuji would turn around as he would see Kenjaku. Yuji would laugh and ask Kenjaku if Sukuna sent his dog after him. Kenjaku would only let off a slight chuckle, calling Yuji amusing. However, this is where things would end between him and Yuji. Yuji's done enough in helping him forward his plan. However, with the barriers almost filled, Yuji is no longer needed in his plan. And right now, he's nothing but an extra variable that Kenjaku simply needs to take care of. As Yuji would laugh, asking Kenjaku, is he sure someone like him will be able to take on Yuji? Kenjaku would laugh out, saying that he saw the performance between him and Sukuna. He assumed Yuji to be this all-powerful being. That pressure that his cursed energy puts out, it's nothing but a scare tactic. He would laugh at Yuji, telling him that he can only hold those down that are weaker than him. Yuji would then laugh again, asking Kenjaku does he not recall him being held down not too long ago. However, Kenjaku would simply tell Yuji that of course he remembers. He remembers playing along with Yuji, telling Yuji that he isn't as strong as he thinks he is. Yuji would ask Kenjaku if that was actually so, and if they're willing to test this out right here. He would then remind Kenjaku that Sukuna has been the only person that's been able to cause Yuji to be even the slightest bit nervous. Aside from Satoru Gojo, of course. Kenjaku would laugh and tell Yuji that he's going to want to re-evaluate his list in the afterlife then. As Yuji would simply smile, Yuji would then simply say to Kenjaku, shall we skip the formalities then? As he would get himself ready. As Kenjaku would say, by all means. Just then, Yuji would notice fingers falling from the sky. He would be confused as they would all begin to glow, blowing up directly in his face. However, Yuji would have been able to guard the attack just in time. He couldn't believe he couldn't notice the presence of another person. That was supposed to be his whole thing. He would then look up as he would see multiple teeth heading his direction, as they would also be glowing. Yuji would then expel a miniature barrier around himself, causing the teeth to drop straight through the ground, causing an explosion to happen on his feet. At the same time, Yuji would use the rubble to bounce up into the air, going to where the falling teeth were coming from. This is where Yuji would then see Hazanoki flying on a creature, shocked beyond belief, because he didn't think Yuji would be able to get up here, as Yuji would tell Hazanoki that he was in his way and that he needs to move. However, from the right of Yuji, a flying cursed spirit would come in, crashing itself directly into Yuji's arm,
causing him to be knocked backwards into a building nearby. Yuji would kiss his teeth, realizing that he has to take this battle a lot more serious. Yuji would then activate his technique, causing his entire body to crack, and just as Kenjaku and Hazunoki would take a look towards Yuji, his entire body would then begin to shatter into 1,000 pieces. Kenjaku wasn't buying this though. Kenjaku would place his hands on the ground, summoning a bunch of lower grade cursed spirits, as he would simply take inspiration from Sukuna. The second Kenjaku sees any type of illusions, he will rip them to shreds. There's no point in taking risk on what's real and what's not real with Yuji. However, from behind Kenjaku, he would hear the words, "Yo." As Kenjaku would turn around, he would then see Gojo, but he knows this has to be an illusion. There's no way. He would then send a whole bunch of low-grade cursed spirits straight towards Gojo. As they would crash into him, Kenjaku would notice, instead of going straight through him, they were stopped right in front of him, like a barrier. Kenjaku would then begin to sweat. There was no way, right? Reaching into his robe, he would realize that the prison realm is gone. He would then curse at himself, as Gojo would close the distance on Kenjaku, telling him that it's been a little while, maybe they should catch up. Kenjaku would then feel a pull. Gojo would have used blue, pulling Kenjaku forward as he would rocket a punch straight towards Kenjaku's gut. This punch would cause Kenjaku to be winded as he would be blown back. He would curse to himself, wondering when the hell did Yuji even take the prison realm? He had no opening to take the prison realm, so how was this even possible? As Gojo would yell out that he shouldn't be distracted in the middle of a fight, sending a red straight towards Kenjaku, sending him flying once more, blowing him back into a building. However, Kenjaku would immediately get up, screaming out that his will not be tarnished by someone like him. He's waited 1,000 years for this. There's no way he was going to idly sit back and let someone like Gojo kill him. Gojo would scream back out that he can try. However, things weren't going to end well for him. Gojo would then shoot out another red, as Kenjaku would use one of his cursed spirits to take the attack. As Kenjaku would spin around the attack, he would begin sprinting straight towards Gojo. He knew that even if he were to use domain amplification, he didn't know if he was going to be able to take out Gojo, or take out his barrier at least. So he was going to try to bait Gojo into attacking him so he could attack back, closing the distance on himself and Gojo. Gojo would throw another punch, as Kenjaku would summon one of his cursed spirits, making the attack strike Gojo in the arm. As Kenjaku would be amazed, the attack actually landed. However, amazement would turn into confusion. The attack actually landed. It would then immediately click inside of Kenjaku's head. This wasn't Satoru Gojo at all. He would laugh to himself, thinking that there was no way his techniques gotten to this level. The illusions were already hard to tell apart from reality. However, to be able to make someone this detailed to where Kenjaku could barely tell, he knows that if Satoru Gojo was here, no matter what attack Kenjaku would have tried to land, it would not have connected like that. Not that easily. So who was he actually fighting? Kenjaku would simply duck down to the ground, summoning a massive wave of cursed spirits. He would then scream out, calling out Yuji, that was pretty smart of him. However, he won't get done in that easily. Everything that he said still stands. He will not let his 1,000-year plan go to waste just like that. His will is absolute, as he would summon more of his flying cursed spirits, sending them in every direction. Taking a page out of Sukuna's book, he would make the curses go haywire, destroying everything in his vicinity, as the entire town would then begin to shatter, as the entire area around them would transform into a forest. Kenjaku would laugh and say that he couldn't believe that Yuji was able to create something of this caliber. He wonders what more Yuji will be able to create. The first thing Kenjaku is going to do is transplant himself into Yuji's body. His technique is something that would allow Kenjaku to do whatever he wanted. However, Yuji would laugh, already being behind Kenjaku, telling Kenjaku that he couldn't possibly fathom what's inside of Yuji's body, as Yuji would send a punch straight towards Kenjaku's torso, as it would connect, causing Kenjaku to be blasted back into a tree. Kenjaku had never fought Yuji head on. However, he couldn't believe Yuji had that much power behind his attacks. However, Kenjaku knew that he needed to gather himself quickly, snapping out of it immediately, summoning a cursed spirit to get him right side up. As Yuji would already be closing the distance, Kenjaku would simply have to use his brain for this battle. The absolute thing he took pride in was his knowledge in sorcery, his knowledge about the world in general. He wasn't going to let some brat show him up. Yuji would close the distance once again, throwing a left this time. However, Kenjaku would grab the attack this time, Grabbing it with his right hand, he would pull Yuji closer as he would elbow him in the face, causing Yuji to be dazed just for a little bit, but Kenjaku would follow up the attack, sending 3 quick strikes to Yuji's torso. Yuji would be pushed back slightly, however, he would regain himself, sending a kick straight towards Kenjaku. However, Kenjaku would lift his leg and lower his arm, blocking the attack. Yuji, however, would then use his back foot and twist off of it, sending another kick straight towards Kenjaku's head, connecting with Kenjaku, sending him flying back once more. Kenjaku wouldn't accept it, but he knew he couldn't win like this. Although it was only a light amount of attacks, Kenjaku had already taken heavy damage, and he could tell Yuji was doing something to him. Every time Yuji would attack Kenjaku, his body would get heavier and heavier. Although the effect was light at first, every time Yuji was able to land an attack, either if Kenjaku was blocking or not, the weight on his body would still begin to collect itself. Eventually, Kenjaku won't be able to move at all. He needs to finish this fast, and right now, Kenjaku would then do the most sensible thing. He would make hand signs as he would begin to scream out the words domain expansion. However, Yuji would decide not to deploy his domain. Kenjaku, using womb perfusion, would laugh out, telling Yuji that it doesn't matter where he is now. Yuji would then use his curse technique, summoning numerous amounts of illusions that all looked exactly like him, as well as erupting a barrier around himself. He would make his illusions walk in circles around Kenjaku, getting closer and closer, as Kenjaku would notice that his sure hit effect wasn't working. What could possibly be going on? He would scan each and every last one of the illusions, wondering where Yuji could actually be. This is when Yuji would pop up from behind Kenjaku, attempting to throw a punch. However, Kenjaku would then smile. As the domain would cease, Kenjaku would use his anti-gravity technique, pushing Yuji into the ground. As the illusions before him would begin to shatter, Kenjaku would laugh, smiling, saying that he couldn't believe that he got Yuji with something so simple. He would then rush forward, pulling his leg back, striking Yuji straight in the head, sending him flying into some trees nearby. Kenjaku would then blurt out to Yuji, "Your plan didn't work out the way that you wanted it to, did it?" As Yuji would simply laugh. He would then begin to tell Kenjaku that it's not as if he caught him off guard or anything. It's just, everything is finally complete. Kenjaku, realizing what Yuji was about to do, would begin to use reverse gravity technique on Yuji, slamming him into the ground once more. Kenjaku would then begin to tell Yuji that he can't believe that someone like him believes this feeble dream of his could possibly come true. Dreams of a better world, where curses, regular people, and Jujutsu sorcerers could coexist. This isn't some fairy tale that you read in a book. This is reality. You're just something I created to pass the time, to bring back the golden age of Jujutsu. And once I kill you, everything will go smoothly. Yuji would then begin to laugh. He would tell Kenjaku that he couldn't believe him at all. Everything that's been happening has been because Yuji wanted it to happen. From the very beginning, since Yuji first met Tengen, every single thing that he's wanted to happen has happened so far. And this fight between himself and Kenjaku was the final straw, the final bit of cursed energy that he needed to pull together everything down from meeting Kenjaku and showing off a bit of his power, so both Sukuna and Kenjaku can be threatened. He would tell Kenjaku that if he would have just stuck with Sukuna, maybe things would have gone the way that he wanted it to go. The barriers were now full, and it was time for Yuji to become the perfect being. Kenjaku would scream out, however, it would already be too late. Yuji would have made hand signs, making each one of the colony barriers shake, as a giant wave of cursed energy would begin swirling through the air. Kenjaku would then laugh, asking Yuji, did he really think that was all to his plan? Yuji did make the barriers, however, Kenjaku will always be one step ahead. Kenjaku would then summon a few cursed spirits that he had sent out before, as they would bring civilians straight towards him. He would laugh and tell Yuji that people will die if he continues to do this plan. Kenjaku will make sure every single one of the civilians inside of the barriers will die. He will make sure he grinds them into paste and contradict this oh so perfect world that Yuji wants to create, as he would have one of the cursed spirits give him a civilian, as he would hold the civilian by its neck. Squeezing the civilian's neck, he would ask Yuji what was his next plan of operations. If he didn't go along with what Kenjaku told him to do already, he was going to kill this civilian and every last one of them that were out there. Yuji, however, would begin to laugh. He didn't understand Kenjaku. Did Kenjaku really think that a mere civilian would interrupt Yuji's plan to becoming the perfect being? It doesn't matter who dies prior to him becoming the perfect being.
All that matters is what happens after. Kenjaku would scream out, calling Yuji a hypocrite. However, Yuji would simply smile and say that all of this is according to his plan, as Yuji would finally let the cursed energy flow straight into his body. As he would begin to undergo a transformation, Kenjaku would look upon Yuji. However, nothing had changed. He still looked exactly as he did, but Yuji could feel it. The ginormous surge of cursed energy flowing throughout his body, merging himself with Tengen, and then having this cursed energy merge with him as well. This was something different. This was perfection. As Yuji would begin to speak, Kenjaku, everything that you have planned, everything that you thought was going to come to fruition, was something that I had already planned myself. You're nothing but a bug that needs to be squashed. I have been waiting for this moment patiently. Everything falls down to this. I'm going to kill you, and then I'm going to kill Sukuna. And once everything is done, the world shall be shaped in exactly the perfect image. However, this is only the beginning stage. Kenjaku would then begin to blurt out, telling Yuji that nothing has changed. He's exactly the same. All of his efforts won't be in vain. He's going to kill Yuji here and now. As Kenjaku would put his all into this next attack, he would collect every last bit of cursed energy and cursed spirits that he have and morph them together, creating a powerful Uzumaki, telling Yuji that nothing was going to go the way that he wanted it to go. Right now, everything ends. As Yuji would tell Kenjaku that yes, everything is going to end right now. As he would appear next to Kenjaku before Kenjaku had the chance to even think. Yuji would exert his cursed energy as Kenjaku would be forced straight to the ground. The pressure that his cursed energy was exuding was ridiculous. This was nothing like what Yuji was doing before. Before, it was slightly hard to stand up. However, now, it's completely impossible to stand up at all. Not even that. Kenjaku was being completely crushed by Yuji's cursed energy, as Yuji would simply look upon himself, examining his hands, his entire body. This was only his first stage of perfection. The more he gets used to this cursed energy, the more his body will evolve. And the only way that he could do that is if he continues to fight and use the cursed energy at his disposal. He's going to destroy Kenjaku, kill the cursed spirits that come out of him, and then go straight for Sukuna. However, Kenjaku would scream out that his will would not be disrupted by someone like Yuji, someone that was supposed to be his pawn, someone that was only supposed to be a vessel for Sukuna. There's no way Kenjaku will let someone like him take over everything that he's been preparing for these thousands of years. However, Yuji would simply tell Kenjaku that, no, everything is done. You are done. It's time to give it up, Kenjaku. As he would increase the pressure on his cursed energy, causing Kenjaku's legs and arms to snap out of place. As his body would continue to be crushed, slowly and agonizingly, Kenjaku would slowly meet his fate, as he would die right there on the spot, turned into a pile of goop. As the cursed spirits that were still inside Kenjaku would begin to spew out, as Yuji would simply point his finger, as every single cursed spirit that was spilling out of Kenjaku would be squashed in an instant. As Yuji would simply state that it was time for phase 2 of his plan. Yuji would make sure to find the Jujutsu sorcerers and finally let them in on his plan. None of them could actually stop him now, so they were free to do whatever they wanted. He would find the Jujutsu sorcerers as he would begin to walk up towards them. As Yuta could feel it, this energy was completely different than what he felt before from Yuji. Yuji was already strong in his own right. However, whatever he's done made his strength almost quadruple. Even while suppressing it, Yuta could feel it. The cursed energy was out of this world. No one should ever have this amount of cursed energy in life. Yuji was a completely different being. Yuji would greet Yuta as he would tell him that now that he has obtained perfection and killed Kenjaku, the culling games are officially over. Yuji had only set Kenjaku and himself as the game masters. In doing so, Yuji could end the culling games whenever he wanted. But he needed to feel the barriers in order to gain his perfected form. That was the entire premise of this mess. But now that everything is over, he wants him to find someone named Hana or Angel. They will be the person that will free Gojo Satoru. And once Gojo Satoru is free, Yuji will go straight after Sukuna and kill him. He will meet up with all of his people that he has gathered so far, so they can take care of Sukuna's posse. Yuta would ask Yuji, is everything actually going to be alright? It is still Sukuna, and who knows how strong he is now. Yuji would tell Yuta that he has no need to worry at all, even though Sukuna is insanely strong and he's known to be the king of curses. Everything will go according to Yuji's will. The age of Jujutsu sorcery will change, and the world will be perfected. He just needs the Jujutsu sorcerers to trust him. He won't do anything reckless or think about trying to control the world or anything. He just wants to create a world to where people like his grandfather could live in peace. This was his entire plan all along. Once Sukuna is dead, that world will be possible. Yuji would tell everyone that he will create a world where everybody can coexist. Humans, cursed spirits, and Jujutsu sorcerers. No one will have to kill anybody. The world will be perfect. There will be no hatred towards humans. There will be no hatred towards cursed spirits. There will be no hatred towards Jujutsu sorcerers. Those who do not abide by these rules shall be punished thoroughly. Yuta would question Yuji, asking if something like this will really even work. He would tell Yuji if that were the case, then would Gojo not have been able to do that himself while being titled the strongest? Yuji would laugh and simply tell Yuta that even though Gojo was titled the strongest, his mind was incredibly weak, troubled by past connections in the Jujutsu society itself. There was no way someone like Gojo could do something like this. He was so stuck up on being the strongest that he couldn't overlook the simple things. The loneliness that he says that comes with being the strongest isn't something to look down upon. That loneliness is only from those who force themselves into that position. Being strong does not mean you have to take on every burden alone by yourself. If you have the strength to do something, then you should change the world as you see fit. Yuta would then ask Yuji. He knows Yuji slightly told him about what he wanted in this new world. However, what was his real objective? Yuji would then tell Yuta once again, his only objective is to make the perfect world. One where people can coexist with one another. One where people can live their life truly. One where people don't have to worry about if they're going to die to a cursed spirit or if a Jujutsu sorcerer is going to die. One where people can just live normally and nothing odd happens. Once he allows them to free Gojo, he himself will go take on Sukuna, and he doesn't want a single person to intervene. There doesn't need to be any needless deaths or anyone else getting hurt. Yuji has already caused enough suffering for everybody else. Everything else that was meant to be done was simply going to be up for Yuji to deal with. It's not him taking on the burden either. It's him simply enacting the plan that he's had in motion since the very first day he enrolled in Jujutsu High School. Yuta would simply sigh and tell Yuji. That he wishes him the best of luck. He hopes that Yuji is actually able to create the world that he says he's going to create. He would tell Yuji that he's going to stick to his plan and free Gojo. He will tell Gojo about his plan after he is freed. Yuji would simply nod his head. As Yuta would ask, does Yuji really not need any type of help against Sukuna? However, Yuji would simply tell Yuta that he has his own group and he doesn't need any help from anybody else besides them. He would tell Yuta to make sure he frees Satoru Gojo and that Yuji will finish everything else from now on. Starting now, this was the final stretch. Everything that came after this was do or die. If Yuji were to die, then the world would not become his perfect sanctuary that he wants to create, and the Jujutsu society will simply stay as it is. Things need to change, and people need to die for the greater good. Yuji would go around, gathering his people, asking them once more if they were ready, finding Yuki, Uro, Higuruma, and Choso, as all of them, seeing how Yuji was now, would agree. If it was Yuji, he has the chance to beat Sukuna, as well as changing this world altogether. On the other hand, Sukuna was ready for Yuji. He had been waiting for Yuji this entire time. He had killed Kashimo and had made quick work of Yorozu. All he was waiting for now was for Yuji to come and face him. He had been playing his technique back in his head numerous times, and he knew eventually Yuji was going to come to face him. He couldn't wait. Yuji was already shown to be promising, someone who was strong in Jujutsu and knew secrets about Jujutsu that other people didn't seem to utilize. even showing Sukuna different ways to use Jujutsu sorcery. Yuji was extraordinary to Sukuna, someone that if even Sukuna defeated, he would remember his name for the rest of his life. And that energy he felt earlier, he knows for a fact that it was Yuji, and that he completed his transformation. The last time he had fought Yuji, he had completely bisected all of his clones, and was able to easily tell which one was the real Yuji and which one wasn't. With the help of Arame, he was able to make up for the missing fingers that he had, equaling himself to 20 fingers worth. Sukuna was now at full power, completely waiting for Yuji, as Yuji was still only in the first forms of his transformations. Everything was going according to plan. The Jujutsu sorcerers had unsealed Satoru Gojo, and had told him the plan about what Yuji was doing. Gojo would laugh and say that Yuji was always something special. To think he was strong enough to be able to capture me, and on top of that, now he's fixing his mess. What a guy. As the stage would be set, Yuji would ready his people, telling them that they shouldn't interfere between the fight between himself and Sukuna, and that they should only worry about the other one, or anyone else who was in alliance with Sukuna. He would simply tell them to take care of anyone else while he takes care of Sukuna himself. Meeting in the middle of Shinjuku, both Yuji and Sukuna would prepare themselves. This was the final battle. Everything was riding on this. If Sukuna lost, all of his ideals will be squashed, and Yuji will be able to create the perfect world. However, even if Yuji were to lose to Sukuna here, there was still another sorcerer strong enough to take on Sukuna. Mei would send her crows out to watch the battle between Yuji and Sukuna. As everyone would begin to watch, it would be Yuji's people versus Sukuna's people. Yuji would have Higuruma go after Urame, seeing as he was the most inexperienced out of all of the people that he had recruited so far, and he would simply have the others on standby just in case something went wrong with Higuruma or wrong with him. The final battle was finally here. Sukuna, at his full power, versus an evolved Yuji. Both parties would take a step forward, with Sukuna grinning at Yuji, telling him that he can't believe a brat like him was able to get this strong. Sukuna would then chuckle, saying that in his years of being a sorcerer, he's never met someone quite like Yuji. At first, Sukuna hated Yuji and wanted to grind him to paste, but now Sukuna can't help but admire Yuji, even if slightly. He's able to do whatever to get the power that he needs, and that's the type of person that Sukuna enjoys. Someone who's willing to throw everything away in pursuit of power. Yuji, however, would simply shake his head, telling Sukuna that no, he isn't simply blindly in pursuit of power. He's nothing like Sukuna. The world will not be run by fear, but it will be ran by someone with authoritative power. Yuji does not want to use his power to control people. He only granted himself this power to make sure people will coexist. Sukuna would then gag, telling Yuji that his fairy tale world is still such a bland idea. He would tell Yuji that he should crush everything underneath his foot and take everything. Only the strongest are able to dictate what happens in this world, and Yuji has the potential to be exactly that. However, he does nothing but lollygag and freelance, doing nothing but nonsense. Yuji would simply laugh, telling Sukuna that his ideals are simply those of the past. The new age that Yuji will make to come into fruition will be the new golden age of Jujutsu. Hearing this, Sukuna would kiss his teeth. Getting upset, he would ask Yuji, does he really believe he can create a new golden age of Jujutsu? However, Yuji would simply smile, saying that of course he can. However, that was enough talking. I'm only here for one thing, Sukuna, and that is to kill you. Sukuna would then unfold his hands, telling Yuji that he should come try it then. Yuji would smile, saying with pleasure, as within the first breath after Sukuna said that, Yuji would have already been in front of Sukuna, throwing a punch straight towards Sukuna's chest. Sukuna would smile, catching the attack with one of his hands. However, Yuji would then begin exerting his cursed energy, causing the area around them to be pressurized. However, something Yuji didn't expect was Sukuna was able to counter this using domain amplification. Sukuna would smile at Yuji, telling him that this trick won't work anymore. As Sukuna would use one of his top arms, throwing a backhand straight towards Yuji's face, striking him, causing Yuji to be pushed back. Just then, Sukuna would close the distance, sending an attack of his own. However, Yuji would also send an attack, causing the two fists to clash. Sukuna would then smile,
taking a page right out of Yuji's book, creating a small barrier around himself, infused with his own technique. Since he didn't have a cursed energy trait like Yuji, he would imbue the barrier with his technique instead of his cursed energy only. In doing so, it would create small miniature slashes that surrounded Sukuna, causing it to cut Yuji if he were to get anywhere near Sukuna. However, Yuji would simply laugh. He would tell Sukuna that he knows that he came up with that technique, right? Sukuna would only laugh, sending another punch straight towards Yuji. Yuji would parry the attack, getting slightly slashed, while he would tell Sukuna, "You know, there is a fatal flaw when imbuing a technique within a barrier like this. That's why I only exert my cursed energy when doing so." Yuji would use domain amplification, striking Sukuna straight in his stomach, breaking the barrier and sending him crashing into a wall. Yuji would then use his curse technique, making another illusion of himself. As both Yujis would rush in, Yuji would begin to explain to Sukuna that enacting a barrier like that was almost like casting a domain. Although the curse technique burnout won't be as severe, there's still a burnout nonetheless. However, Sukuna would smile, pointing his finger out, as a huge slash would be sent straight towards Yuji, catching him off guard for just a second. The illusion of Yuji would be caught by the slash, being shattered on the spot, as Yuji himself would barely dodge the attack, jumping over it, getting one of his legs sliced off. Sukuna would then laugh, rushing forward. He would scream out to Yuji, telling him that he really shouldn't underestimate someone like him, using both of his right arms, sending a punch straight towards Yuji, as it would crash into Yuji's chest, distorting the world around both of them, with Sukuna landing a black flash. However, something was off. Sukuna felt his attack land. He felt the black flash. However, something was still off. This attack would have caused Yuji to crash into a nearby building. However, when Yuji would bring himself out of the rubble, Sukuna would look upon Yuji, and it would seem as if Yuji hadn't taken any damage from that attack at all. Yuji would simply brush the dust off of his clothes. Looking straight towards Sukuna once more, he would tell Sukuna that he doesn't think he understands exactly what's going on right now. Sukuna had the chance to kill Yuji before he was able to evolve, but now that he's been able to evolve, there was absolutely nothing Sukuna could possibly do now to stop him. Yuji would tell Sukuna that he admires him, for he is the king of Jujutsu. If Yuji wasn't here at this moment, and were given the abilities he's given now due to Kenjaku, things might have turned out differently for Sukuna. Yuji would simply tell Sukuna that he needs to consider himself unlucky. It's a shame that Sukuna waited 1,000 years only to die once again. Hearing this would piss Sukuna off. He knows he told Yuji that he admired him slightly. However, that does not give him the justification to talk the way he's talking now. That anger Sukuna felt the first time him and Yuji engaged with one another had never gone away. The words that Sukuna said in that moment, he meant it. He's going to grind Yuji down into nothing but paste, make him a bloodstain on the floor, nothing but a forgotten memory. He will thoroughly make sure Yuji regrets underestimating him. Sukuna would scream out the words, "Domain expansion," as Yuji would simply smile. As Sukuna would erupt his domain, Yuji would activate simple domain around himself, telling Sukuna that this was all pointless. He can't stop the inevitable. You have already lost. Sukuna would then scream out to Yuji that the battle wouldn't be over until Yuji was nothing but a paste of blood on the floor, with Yuji asking Sukuna, "Is that so?" If that is the case, then Yuji would make hand signs, saying the words, "Domain expansion, mirror of 1,000 dreams." This would cause the two domains to clash instantly. Although it only looked like Sukuna's was the active domain, Sukuna could feel the clash of domains happening for however long until one of the domains was able to overtake the other. Now it was a battle of attrition. Sukuna would rush in, attempting to gain the upper hand on Yuji, throwing a punch. However, Yuji would duck underneath it, sending a strong right straight towards Sukuna's stomach. However, Sukuna would take the attack, raising his hands in the air and slamming his fist down onto Yuji, with Yuji being able to just barely block it in time. However, Yuji would use this time to drop low, sweeping Sukuna's legs, causing him to trip over. However, Sukuna would instantly catch himself, hopping off his other hand, launching himself straight towards Yuji,
as Yuji would deflect the attack, causing both of them to gain quite the amount of distance from one another. Sukuna would rush in once more, as Yuji would exert his cursed energy, causing the pressure around him to increase, making Sukuna's movements just slightly more sluggish. However, Sukuna wasn't going to let up. He would throw in another attack at Yuji, sending a strong left with both of his arms. It would connect with Yuji, however, it wouldn't have as much power as it had before, with Yuji taking the attack and grabbing both of Sukuna's arms. He would then push out as much cursed energy as he could through his fist, causing the pressure around his fist to increase, sending a punch straight towards Sukuna's face. As it would connect, the attack was a lot more devastating than Sukuna thought it was going to be, causing him to be crashed backwards into his own domain, making the domain fall, which in doing so, would allow Yuji to win the domain clash. Sukuna would hurry up and try to use Hollow Wicker Basket. However, Yuji only needed a brief second for the domain sure hit effect to take effect. However, Sukuna wasn't buying this. He would make a quick deduction that Yuji's domain sure hit had to do something with illusions. He would think to himself and believe that nothing he sees from now on can be guaranteed to be real. If anything, he would slash everything apart. He didn't care. Let it be his own allies. He was going to kill everything in sight if it meant he was able to kill Yuji. However, Yuji would stand before Sukuna and ask him one question. Does all of this really matter to you? You'll die a useless death, and in the end, you will be forgotten. You will die here, Sukuna, and that world that you want to create will not come. Kenjaku's plan has already been foiled. Therefore, you are by yourself and have nothing going for you. You have one person that is willing to stick by your side until the very end, yet you don't even see that person. And at the same time, what would you do even if I were to die? Would you kill everything in sight? Would you take over the Jujutsu world? How exactly would you, being in power, make anything good happen? You will live the same boring life that you once did before, at the very peak of power, living the rest of your life for who knows how long. Is that how you want to live, Sukuna? Sukuna would laugh, telling Yuji to stop with the pleasantries. He doesn't want to be converted. He doesn't want to live some peaceful life. This is what he does as a Jujutsu sorcerer. Everything that he's done up until now has been because he wanted to go that way. If he's killed, it's been because he's wanted to. If he allowed somebody to live, it's been because he wanted that person to live. If he let something happen, it's because he wanted it to happen. That is what Sukuna means when he says those in power are able to do whatever they want. He would tell Yuji that people fear people like him and Yuji, those with absolute power and the ability to take on the world with barely lifting a finger. Yuji would simply cross his arms and begin to tell Sukuna that he had hoped that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to save someone like him. However, it would seem that it wasn't the case at all. Yuji would sigh, telling Sukuna that it's a shame that he has to kill someone like him. He would then tell Sukuna that maybe in his next life, he will understand the value of life and what exactly he was doing wrong. Sukuna would be confused. Yuji was talking as if the battle was already over. This would piss Sukuna off even more. Sukuna would yell out to Yuji, "What is a brat like him even talking about? You talk as if the battle is already over. You talk as if you are being lenient on me, giving me another chance at life. Why are you looking down on me so much? Do you really believe that you are that much stronger than me? I'll grind you to paste and eat your flesh." However, Yuji would simply laugh, telling Sukuna that no, the battle was already over. The moment Sukuna and Yuji locked eyes with one another, the battle was already over, and there was absolutely nothing Sukuna could do about it. The entire thing was a trap from the get-go. There was not going to be some kind of ultimate battle where Yuji would put his life on the line to kill Sukuna. It was simply Sukuna would show up and Yuji would kill him. He would tell Sukuna that he believes Urarame is probably already defeated and that he was giving him one last chance to surrender. However, it doesn't seem as if Sukuna's going to do that. So now, Sukuna will simply die. Sukuna would then realize what Yuji was talking about from the fighting from earlier. From Sukuna landing his black flash, he knew something was off. He just couldn't put his finger on it. And now, everything was connecting. The only thing Sukuna could do was laugh. He couldn't believe it. A brat like this, as the world around him would begin to crack, and then everything would simply shatter. The entire time, from the very beginning, Sukuna was already under Yuji's illusions. The entire battle was nothing but a facade, orchestrated by Yuji to show Sukuna the immense gap in power. The real Yuji this time would step forward in front of Sukuna, exerting his cursed energy, causing Sukuna to fall to one knee, as this pressure was a lot more prominent than the one he had felt earlier. Sukuna would look up at Yuji, telling him that he's nothing but a brat, and one day, this world that he's trying to create will collapse in on itself. Everything that Yuji is trying to create will collapse eventually. May it be by one person or many. Eventually, everything will catch up to Yuji and everything will balance out. Yuji cannot stay in power forever, and he knows that as well. You can't have one without the other in Jujutsu sorcery. That's just how it is. Yuji would then tell Sukuna that that's up for him to figure out, as he would increase the pressure, causing Sukuna to be crushed, causing Sukuna to be simply nothing but a pool of blood on the floor, as everything was finally over. Everything that Yuji had been planning, the entire fight, consuming Tengen, consuming the cursed energy in the barriers, everything was finally done. Now the only part was to move to the final phases of his plan. He's going to dismantle the Jujutsu Society as it is right now and rework it in his own eye, as Yuji's people would walk forward, telling him that everything had been handled prior to before he defeated Sukuna, and the Jujutsu sorcerers would begin making their way towards Yuji. Gojo would be the first to walk forward, asking Yuji, what exactly does he plan on doing now? He's defeated Kinjaku, killed Sukuna. What else is there for him to do? Yuji would tell Gojo that from now on, things will be incredibly simple. He's going to dismantle the Jujutsu Society as it is now. No one will be a weapon, and everyone will live peacefully. He would look Gojo in the eyes and tell him that that burden of being the strongest is no longer his to carry. Although Yuji never saw it as a burden, Gojo would simply smile, telling Yuji that he's trained up a great student, as Yuji would simply say that he was never his student. And I think I'm going to end that here. I know it might not be what you guys expected, but it literally can't be any longer than this. The only reason I say that is because the second Yuji evolves, there was really no one that could match him. That's why I try to power scale it to where everyone is effectively even until the end of the series, because it just makes it a lot more enjoyable. And by time end of series comes, we already know what their full potential could actually look like, and we know if Aizen was in JJK, he'd pretty much have the world under his foot. So, but yeah, I will be trying to do modular one shots for majority of my what ifs, but not now. I don't know if it'll be anytime soon, but I really do want to do that because I also would like to try to figure out how the Sumerians would interact with these Yujis. But yeah, thank you for listening. Sorry for taking so long. And yes, I love you all. Thank you for waiting. Peace.